Now we are live. It's so wonderful here to be together with all of you for the second Beyond Humanism Forum. This time it's dedicated sort of to the future of education and how post-human studies as a field will develop further, how we can integrate it actually in the university curriculum, maybe in school curriculum as well, because it deals with all the central challenges of our time. And again, I really must thank in particular Stasienko and Evi Sampanikou for having done just an fulfilled enormous task by putting together the Posthuman Studies Reader, which will be the core text for many courses, because it's a perfectly suited as a textbook for a course on posthuman studies. But basically anyone who wants to become familiar with the field of posthuman studies could basically, after having read the reader, would have the appropriate background, appropriate foundation for discussing on the great variety of topics with which we are concerned and with which we are confronted today. What posthuman studies does, from my perspective, it sort of enables you to develop a theoretical background, enables you to have, it provides you with a new terminology for addressing the challenges with which we are confronted. And so, yeah, please have a look at the Posthuman Studies Reader. Here it is. It's a wonderful book. It's very detailed, and the editors have done an enormous job by putting together also introductions, further explanations, writing the introductory text, the pedigrees text. So many, many thanks for having done that to the emerging field of posthuman studies. And today we're already the second day of the second Beyond Humanism Forum. We've got an enormous lineup of wonderful intellectuals. Yesterday, I thought I've benefited enormously from the great variety of exchanges we've had. It was extremely stimulating, sort of in particular with sort of the lineup. Sort of first there's a speaker giving a presentation, a critical review of the reader, and then afterwards it's the organizers of the event who respond to the reflections. And I need to mention that, and I need to announce that. Please participate in the discussion. So there is the chat box next to the YouTube channel, next to the YouTube videos, and here you can write down your questions. Please, if you join us, write down your name, say hello, greet us, stay in contact. It's a way of being engaged in these tricky digital times. Unfortunately, we can't properly manage, have a coffee and have exchanges as we normally do, go to the beach together during the Beyond Humanism conferences, which is normally wonderful, a very intimate, a very lively atmosphere. Now, unfortunately, in these remote rooms, digital distances, we need to find different ways of engaging. So please write down your questions in the chat box. That enables us to stay in contact. Jaime, do you want to add anything?
Well, just maybe remind about some of the discussions that we had yesterday through our wonderful speakers, Carmel Weisman, Joseph Raylan, Nina Sellers, Anna Marco Polo, and also ourselves, the organizers. We were touring around the questions posed in the introduction, which you hopefully have read. And just in case you didn't, or you didn't read it or hear about it yesterday, I will just take a couple of minutes to remind you about it. So the title we gave to this forum is Glocal, Metahumanities, a Posthuman Studies Reader Symposium. And we ask the following questions just as a provocation for starting the discussion, hopefully going on today. How to enable plural modes of relation that do not assume a universalistic, homogenizing paradigm of globalization, and which are at the same time exceeding an isolated locality? The idea of the glocal haunts discourses critical with globality for decades. What could post-trans metahumanistic approaches provide to this debate in challenging not only discourses, but also practices, media, and a reinvention of sensibility? How to develop a new care for ourselves, others, and the earth in times of surveillance capitalism, when the algorithms in our pockets defy every science fiction imagination. How to deal with the global systemic abuses and exploitation of other humans, non-human animals, and the planet, when dominant models of consumption are covering Africa with digital waste, the oceans with plastic, and space with garbage, when production is delocalized in an invisible slavery, crossing oceans in giant cargo ships, polluting, when data centers consume astronomical amounts of energy while bodies are increasingly immobile and atrophied, clicking on screens in the internet panoptic, while climate change rises and with it pandemic outbreaks. What singularity of planetary disruption is the global pointing to, and how could one decenter that vortex in ways that don't reproduce the ground mistakes of humanism and colonialism? Is the all too human a trash human, and how to revert its planetary enhancement? How to regain the innocence of becoming on the movement of creative evolution? How to move on towards a planetary health? Perhaps a world of partial connections that assume the undesirability of subjecting the universe to a homogenizing vision. A world where the irreducibility of experience to pure quantification can be claimed back against the onset of a generalized flattening. A world of foams rather than globes, as Sloterdijk might say. Or, and if, what about? The recently published Posthuman Studies Reader gives us a starting point for discussion and an opportunity to reflect upon these and other pressing issues from a multiplicity of diverse and even divergent perspectives, staging a more than necessary plurality for contestable futures and ecologies to come. So once again, in this Beyond Humanism Forum, we'll bring together more distinguished scholars and thinkers from Africa, Australia, South and North America, Asia, Middle East, and Europe for a plurifocal post-transhumanistic, metahumanistic exchange of situated bodies across and beyond regions. So yesterday we were expanding on some of these ideas, including my own elaboration on the trash human and enhancement and planetary health, which I invite you for sure to check in the video of yesterday, but also very especially the wonderful talks of Carmel Weisman, Joseph Rail, and Nina Sellers, and Anna Marco Polo, and the lively discussions we had with the other speakers. So today we are going to start with
David. Yes, David. He's going to be the first speaker, and this is, I'm sure a lot of people are already looking forward to his presentation. So I'm, very happy that he is with us today. But we've got another spectacular lineup also for the rest of today, and I'm happy to see so many people joining us already. Seeing the comments in the YouTube box. There are people from India. There are many people. Oh yeah, from yesterday's speaker, Carmel is here with us. So please use that chat box as a means of further exchange. And maybe Jan, Evi, what do you want to say? What do you want to add to our comments?
I would like to welcome everybody for the second day of the conference, and would like to tell that if we yesterday had a great group of speakers who were also reviewers of our reader, for today we have another group of wonderful thinkers, including the authors, renowned authors of papers from our readers. So it is our great pleasure and honor to host David Pearce and Katherine Hayles, but also the rest of the wonderful speakers for today. So I'm expecting great and fruitful discussion.
Yes, Evi, please.
I'm also welcoming everyone in today's forum. Yesterday we had amazing talks. Therefore, I'm looking forward to listening to our today participants. As Jan has already said, authors included in the reader are here with us tonight. And also, maybe some of the authors that are going to be included to the next one, I hope. Well, that's all from me for now.
And because of that global approach, we're trying to establish the connections between all the various different parts of the world, and showing sort of always the local twist, the local approach, realizing that it's sort of about the interrelationality. It's where different perspectives meet, and this is where some tensions, where something exciting is happening. Where it's a, sort of that the tension is creating a new stimulus for new insights and for realizing things we share, but also things which separates us. But that doesn't have to be a problem, but that can be a basis for further elaboration. And if you're working on the field of post-human studies, also I invite you to send the articles you're writing to the Journal of Post-Human Studies. This has been it's the first academic journal explicitly dedicated to the post-human. It was established in 2017 by James Hughes, Sangyu Shim, together with me, and it's coming out twice a year with Penn State University Press. It's coming out both in print as well as online, and we've had an incredible list of authors in that publication already. I mean, from artists like Stella, like Eduardo Kach wrote something. We've got ethicists like Julian Savulescu. We've had philosophers like Wolfgang Welsch. We've had authors, critical posthumanists like Rosie Braidotti. So the lineup has just been an enormous one, has been an excellent one. Actually, I can already tell you in the new issue, which is the issue 1, 2021, which is coming out, there's a wonderful contribution by Nick Ager, so which I strongly recommend you to read it. So if you work in this field, please continue to submit us your articles, because this is basically the foundation for any active field of research, for any active field of an emerging discipline. That we've got loads of researchers, intellectuals, scholars, artists who contribute with their specific perspective and to react to the latest developments in order to promote the exchanges between the thinkers of various different perspectives. So we've continued receiving wonderful articles, and they're all undergoing a very rigid peer review process. So please don't be too discouraged as if you receive criticism. This is part of the exchange, and that's helpful for further growing and for developing further. It should all of the and we always encourage sort of also to reviewers to be in the like positive, encouraging, but still obviously also very critical in so far as we aim at this is like a high class publication venue, and so far we've realized that as a journal. So Jaime, we're getting ready for the beginning.
Yes, sure. But in the last minute we have, let me just add on to what you were saying, that please all of you take this field, the one of the reader, of the journal, and of today's forum, as a contestable one. It's not about establishing a canon, but it's a contestable field which is constantly growing. We already have post, trans, metahumanism, but we are already adding variations, like my proposal this year for a trash humanism, which will perhaps be yet another canonical field in the future that will have to get contested. So please contest today all the potential canons that need to be always undermined by new mobilizations of thought.
And
so we are now about, yes, Evi.
And we need all reflections, because we're aiming at an integration of the fields. I believe that all exchanges, all cultural exchanges and all views are contributing to an integration of the fields within post-humanism, within trans, post, and metahumanism. Yes.
So, Jaime.
Great. So I think it's time for starting with our first speaker. It's my great honor to introduce David Pearce, who will be talking to us from the UK, I think. So, Stefan, please, let's introduce David into the studio.
Yes, I will, and I will add David to the stream.
Testing, 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 testing.
Yes, it's okay.
It's all working fine. You will not be able. You will not be able to hear us when we are behind the screen. So yeah, the floor is all yours. We're looking forward to your presentation, and I'm removing myself.
Hello, it's very good to be with you. My name is David Pearce. I'm a transhumanist. Back in the year 1998, I co-founded the World Transhumanist Association with Nick Bostrom. Transhumanists hope to create a triple S civilization of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. And in the short talk today, rather unusual, surprising topic, I just want to say a little about the possibility of intravenous CRISPR infusion for mental health. Before going any further, though, I want to start with a couple of quotations. One is from Nietzsche, the other is from the World Health Organization. The quote from Nietzsche is as follows, quote, "You want, if possible, and there is no more insane if possible, to abolish suffering. And it really seems that we would rather have it higher and worse than ever. Well-being, as you understand it, that is no goal. That seems to us an end, a state that soon makes man ridiculous and contemptible, that makes his destruction desirable. The discipline of suffering, of great suffering. Do you not know that only this discipline has created all enhancements of man so far?" And that's Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil. And the second quote I want to give you is from just the World Health Organization, its founding constitution, which it's recently reaffirmed. And the World Health Organization defines health as, quote, "a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being." Yes, which conception of our future and transhuman future should we aspire to? Should we aim for the continuation of Darwinian life, which over the past 540 million years has involved horrendous suffering? Or should we aim for a civilization based on gradients of intelligent bliss? And I think the only civilized option is to aim for a civilization that is based on gradients of intelligent bliss. Now, intuitively, this is quite, this is science fiction. Yes, maybe our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren will be able to rewrite their own genetic source code, recalibrate the hedonic treadmill, but this is surely far into the future. However, this year has witnessed an extremely exciting development, and that is the first use of intravenous gene therapy to correct a genetic disorder. The genetic disorder is transthyretin amyloidosis. It's a serious progressive disease. It causes the buildup of a toxic protein, and it causes great pain, numbing, heart disease, and death. And whereas until now, CRISPR gene editing has been used mainly as a research tool. If you're going to use CRISPR therapeutically, you've had to essentially take cells out of the body, manipulate them, and put them back in the body. Essentially, this development means that a one-off intravenous fusion of billions of nanoparticles, which contain messenger DNA and guide DNA, can be used to actually modify a gene in the body. And though this is very early days yet, patients in the study in question have seemingly undergone a miraculous recovery. And what does this mean? The implications are far-reaching, because in a few years, it should be, in principle, possible for, let's say, depressive people, but not just depressive people, people in pain, people with all sorts of conditions, people who are nominally healthy, to edit their own source code, genetic source code. And I'm going to give, as an example next, the case of Joe Cameron. Joe Cameron is a 72-year-old vegan retired Scottish school teacher. She is never depressed, never anxious, never feels pain, pillar of the community, socially responsible. She has an extremely elevated hedonic set point. And the reason for this, it transpires, is that she has an unusual genetic mutation, an extremely unusual mutation of her far and far out genes. The consequence of this mutation is that she has unusually high levels of anandamide, which comes from the Sanskrit word meaning bliss, inner contentment. And consequently, she has gone through her life animated by gradients of well-being, gradients of intelligent bliss. And she's an extremely socially responsible person. I've mentioned she is, for example, a vegan, which would put some distinguished professors of philosophy to shame. But nonetheless, she has gone through life with a essentially far richer her quality of life than most people. Most of us kind of trapped at a very low level or relatively low level on the hedonic treadmill. Her hedonic set point is much higher. And the possibility I just briefly want to explore, and I stress this is purely illustrative. There are many other genes we could focus on, but I'm just going to focus on the far and the far out gene. That in a few years time, it would in theory be possible for you to modify your far and far out genes to enjoy anomalously high levels of anandamide. Now, although, as I said, anandamide is short for the Sanskrit for bliss, it's an endogenous endocannabinoid. It's not literally the bliss molecule. Essentially, for its function, it depends on interactions with the opioid system. But essentially, this would give everyone from chronically severely depressed people to people who are neurotypical to essentially have a much higher hedonic set point than they do today. Now, clearly there are immense pitfalls for this kind of genetic modification. I gave this quote from the World Health Organization. Health is a state of complete physical, social, emotional well-being. By this criterion of health, no one in history has ever yet been healthy. So this is unrealistically high. But what we can, I think, aim for is life based on information sensitive gradients of bliss. But of course, one of the potential pitfalls of having an exceptionally high hedonic set point is rose-tinted spectacles. I mean, the reason that many people today are angst-ridden, anxious, social anxiety, depression, all the psychological traumas of Darwinian life is that in the ancestral environment, a predisposition to be anxious or discontented and have all manner of nasty states of mind was adaptive. Now that we are essentially gaining mastery of our own genetic code, we are going to be able to choose the genetic makeup of our future children. But not just that, rapid developments such as the intravenous gene therapy I mentioned mean that the benefits of the technology can be spread to existing humans. And yeah, what I really want to do now is just to essentially just throw open the discussion is to what people think about the ethics and the desirability of manipulating our own genetic source code so that we can become transhuman. I focused on the question of mood, the question of suffering. I regard the problem of suffering as the most morally urgent problem we face. Hundreds of millions of people worldwide are clinically or subclinically depressed. 850,000 people or so each year take their own lives. This is absolutely monstrous. But the ramifications of gene editing stretch beyond mood disorders. It will also be possible to engineer our DNA so that for the purposes of life extension, and also another very hot button topic, even to enhance intelligence. But yeah, there's so much more to be said, but I thought right now perhaps I will throw open the discussion.
Many thanks, David, for raising these extremely important issues. And I would directly like to respond or add some further, like a counter reflection. I want to confront you with a different example, which also has to do with gene editing and dealing with the issue of suffering. But because it doesn't only have to go like promoting the bliss, the well-being, but there is the option one can also remove the capacity of suffering. And there have been scientists actually who've genetically modified mice in order to get rid of the brain, remove the brain from the mice, that only like the stem remains. They can still run around and eat and digest, but they don't have a fully developed brain. They have hardly any brain. But without any brain, there's no capacity for developing consciousness, self-consciousness, and the capacity of suffering either. So if that works on mice, then we could also develop that on pigs, for example. Pigs suffer enormously in animal factories. They are stored so closely to each other, and they're very social beings, but they suffer enormously. And and if suffering is the decisive issue, and if it works genetically to basically create pigs without brains, because it already works on mice, what do you think about creating pigs without brains? Because then these pigs couldn't suffer either, because without brain, no consciousness, no self-consciousness, so the capacity of suffering would be removed too. Would that be a vegan? Would it then be a vegan option to eat a pig without a brain? What do you think about that, David?
Yes, I mean you're absolutely right to focus on the issue of non-human animals, because a pig, for example, is as sentient and as sapient as a pre-linguistic toddler, and we treat non-human animals like pigs in ways that would get the perpetrator locked up for life if the victims were human. And so, yes, there are a number of options. It has been suggested that we use genetic engineering to minimize or mitigate the horrors of factory farming and slaughterhouses. And certainly this would be preferable to the existing system of industrialized animal abuse. But personally, on an from an ethical perspective, I find the idea as abhorrent as doing something similar to orphaned human babies. That instead of trying to mitigate the horrors of animal agriculture, we ought to be systematically helping sentient beings instead. Realistically, I think this is going to come about via the cultured meat revolution. Although in this little discussion, I focused on the question of genetic engineering. Technically, to produce artificial cultured meat, you don't actually need to modify the genetic code at all. Indeed, it's probably going to be important for its salability to stress how it's not genetically engineered. And I think this is the most promising route to end the horrors of animal agriculture. But yeah, essentially all possible avenues must be explored to stop the animal holocaust.
May I add a further twist to this interesting discussion? I think it is contestable and contested where our angst, anxieties, fears, and suffering comes from. Here, for example, anthropologist James Suthman, however you pronounce it in English, who speaks about how all our kinds of fears for the programmable future and so forth stem from 10,000 years ago, from agricultural societies. It's not this kind of universally pre-existing anxiety. It's an anxiety proper to what I call algorithmic cultures. And in any event, much of our modern anxieties have to do with what I was yesterday naming as the atrophy in bodies, which is creating a planetary atrophy. So in order to keep us atrophied, we build this whole machinery, which is unsustainable, which potentially is also the same machinery on which genetic engineering depends. So, of course, when we talk about farming, it's not only the suffering of the animal, but also the kind of cosmic crime that implies immobilizing bodies of any kind, and the unsustainable machinery of the entire industry, from the production, consumption of resources, creation of waste, delocalized industries. All of it is absolutely deliriously unsustainable. So, you know, there are perhaps other ways of thinking how we can elaborate bliss. My own experience doing onto-hacking therapies and onto-hacking techniques about learning again to feel oneself as a body and to move again in more plastic ways with the world, which makes us less reliable upon this whole planetary scale and sustainable machinery, is the kind of approach I propose in order not to rely on any kind of sophisticated technology, which is part of the entire planetary scale unsustainable machinery. And this will, of course, imply also well, a whole new approach to the culture of eating and of relating to the world, including, for sure, veganism, but also we mentioned yesterday the need to do something about the growth of human population, which is also a very serious matter. So more a comment than a question, just adding complexities onto the discussion.
So I see we already got a couple of questions in the comments from YouTube. Unless Evi, Jan, you've got something urgent, I would directly raise a question from YouTube. So here is.
Wait with our questions.
Huh?
You can wait with our questions.
It's better, yes, to have these questions on.
So I will. This is one of the questions which came up from. This can be a potential cure to biological depression, but I'm curious as to how it could alter the perception of someone depressed because of his environment. And explains further, such as children stuck in a war-torn city country like Gaza.
Yes, if you are a kid stuck in, let's say, Gaza and suffering, then you probably don't want to be told that your hedonic set point needs recalibrating with gene therapy. Any serious approach to the problem of suffering has to be twin track. It needs to tackle the environmental sources of suffering, poverty, war, all the manifold ills of society. But any long-term solution is going to have to tackle the biological basis of mood and the hedonic treadmill. I mean, you probably have heard of the so-called lottery paradox, that 6 months after either having a catastrophic accident or winning the lottery, most people will revert to their level of well-being or ill-being before the accident or the tragedy. And however keen, and I could give you an enormous list of all the different ways I would like to reform the world, everything from universal healthcare, universal basic income, guaranteed rights, rights to accommodation, a whole raft of social and political interventions that by themselves, they're not enough. The hedonic treadmill would still grind. And if we're really serious about tackling the problem of suffering, and technically, if not sociologically, it could be done in 100 years, we will actually need to tackle the biological genetic sources of the problem. And that is essentially our DNA. We are Darwinian malware. We are designed to suffer. There is no evidence that on average, our level of well-being or ill-being is greater than or less than that of our ancestors on the African savannah. So, yeah, a twin track approach is essential.
Well, I wonder, could we, because I was eager to see if David had any reaction to my comment previously, because I was challenging this whole thing of where our suffering comes from altogether. What do you think about that?
Well, it's... Yes, I think I would push back on this in that, like you, I have more than reservations, all sorts of criticisms of modern society. And yet, if you look at the biological roots of everything from depression to anxiety disorders to unhappy love and so forth, they are evolutionarily ancient and they preceded modern society. Something like depression, mercifully, it seems that non-human animals, non-social non-human animals don't get depressed, but the origins of depression seem to be an adaptation to group living. Essentially, it's the internal, very simplistically, it's the internalized correlate of the losing subroutine. Low mood is associated with subordination and defeat. And yes, there are sociological, political measures one can adopt, i.e. a much fairer society in which, a much higher level of social justice. But nonetheless, the biological genetic roots of low mood run deep. And there are some people essentially who are predisposed to have an extremely high hedonic set point. And there are other people who have a low hedonic set point. And I think our obligation with the new technology is to ratchet up default well-being, default hedonic tone. And given the title of this conference is Beyond Humanism, essentially I think we should aim to become transhuman and eventually posthuman. And I cautiously predict and advocate that posthuman life will be based on gradient of intelligent bliss that will be orders of magnitude richer than feasible today.
So thank you. We've got a couple of questions from Marcin in the comment section. I will read them out, all three of them, one after the other. So what's the optimal level of anandamide? Supposedly it causes miscarriages at high levels of concentration. Then later on he added, what about the suffering that is a side effect of otherwise satisfying actions like training for a marathon, mastering a difficult skill? And finally, how do you differentiate suffering from pain? Is it simply a psycho versus a soma division?
Good heavens. Enormous questions there. First, optimal levels of anandamide. I have glossed over all the complications of having elevated anandamide function. For example, because of her exceptionally high levels of anandamide, Joe Cameron has an extremely elevated pain threshold. And whereas if you are a retired Scottish school teacher, you can get away. Joe Cameron thought she was normal. She never asked for painkillers. Childbirth felt like a tickle. If you are, let's say, a robust male athlete or something like that who goes in for rough and tumble sports and so on, this is potentially disastrous. So before embarking on anything like a radical program of gene therapy, yes, there will need to be responsibly trials. I'm racing ahead now. Please excuse me for not doing justice to your question. Sorry, the second question, could you...
What about the suffering that is a side effect of otherwise satisfying actions like training, mastering?
Well, this is it. It should be possible. People experience so-called, for example, runner's high, but to an uneven degree. There are some exercise junkies who really do get an extremely strong runner's high, this combination of endogenous opioids and, yes, cannabinoids released by vigorous aerobic exercise. Others, and I'm unfortunately one of them, get a minimal runner's high. And yes, suffering that, or at least pain that is meaningful and significant, is less objectionable than depression. Depression is associated with a sense of meaninglessness, emptiness that shades off into kind of nihilistic despair. But even so, I would just say, even though it's less morally urgent, that even someone who has a pretty high hedonic set point and goes, let's say, for punishing exercise routines, people like that could benefit from a higher hedonic set point too. Essentially, it raises default quality of life, your hedonic tone. Third, how do you differentiate suffering from pain? Is it simply psycho versus soma division? At what threshold does mere pain, a pinprick, for example, or something like that, become outright suffering? Essentially, this is a conventional but not arbitrary matter. In the long run, I think we should be aiming to get rid of any experience below hedonic zero and aiming for information-sensitive gradients of bliss. The information sensitivity is critical. But before embarking on something like this kind of radical transhuman strategy, it makes sense to tackle the worst sources of physical and mental pain. And if we can ratchet up, essentially via biological genetic means, people's hedonic set point and pain thresholds, and even a handful of genetic tweaks could do this, essentially we will radically reduce the burden of suffering in the world, and that is what is most morally urgent. Before getting rid of any experience below hedonic zero, we've got to make sure we know exactly what we're doing, creating, for example, the functional analogues of depressive realism to counterbalance the problem of rose-tinted spectacles, that becomes very, very ambitious. But it's doable.
Wonderful.
Many thanks.
Unless there are new questions.
Yeah, no, because Jan, I mean, because we're already like at 5:30, and in order to be fair to all the participants, I might ask Jan and Evi to ask the questions later on in the general discussion section. And so thanks a lot for your wonderful presentation. And I will now remove you and pass on the word to Jaime to introduce our next speaker. So thanks a lot, David.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. And now it's our great pleasure to introduce Nicolás Antonio Rojas Cortés from Chile. Welcome to our forum, and we now leave you the stage for you, and we will come back in a few minutes for the discussion.
Hey everyone, thank you. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. When Stefan invited me to this event, I even dropped a few tears. It's very exciting for me because when I think of an event of this magnitude, I think of a concert, and if this were a concert, then I have just had the honor of being introduced by Jaime del Val. That's amazing. Thank you. I recently got the first book that begins the posthuman studies, the Nietzschean meditation, and it says something interesting, and I quote, "This is a book about Nietzsche. It is not a book about Nietzsche, sorry. It is a book for Nietzsche." And this is one of the questions I am asking myself, and I would like to ask to the editors of the book Core Readings on Trans, Post, and Metahumanism. Who is this reader for? And don't get me wrong, I'm not asking about the public in a marketing sense, but rather, perhaps in a Nietzschean sense, so we can modulate the question. Who can hear what this book has to say? Many times I doubt that it is possible for everyone to hear this content, and that is not to say that it is content for the few. No, I'm not thinking of Zarathustra. I'm thinking that I have often encountered resistance to the discourses that are present in this book. For example, I once heard from a Hegelian professor that transhumanism was not philosophy, and I think, I can understand him beyond his Hegelian self, because I ask, what does one face when one first approaches transhumanism? Allow me to make a fun story, and I hope you won't be offended, but I think this scene might well characterize what I'm thinking. Imagine you are a common person with an interest in philosophy, and at some point in your everyday life, a stranger approaches you and asks you if you want to become immortal. You're surprised by the question, but you're in a good mood, so you don't want to be rude, and you answer, well, you got my attention. Tell me more. This person hands you his card with a very elegant design that shows some keywords: immortality, cryogenics, silicon something, you know. He tells you that with emerging technologies, in the not too far distant future, it will be possible to eliminate the condition of possibility of our finitude, our body. We will be able to be digitalized and have access to many goods, since happiness is understood by this guy as closely related to living more. So you reveal that you find it interesting, and you want to know how much it costs and what guarantees this process has. He responds with a stratospheric sum of money, a sum that no less than Latino could legally afford, and moreover says that there are no guarantees. His speech sounds confident, like that of a salesman, but it also reflects a certainty that we only find in those who believe the most. In this case, in a true believer in technology. Obviously, you stop talking to this person, you can't access that that money, and you don't understand what assumptions are at work behind its faith. You think about your history of philosophy lessons, you remember Epicurus. You don't know why anyone would believe that living longer makes you happier. You remember the paradox of Theseus' ship. You don't quite understand how an identity works without a body. You remember Nietzsche. You feel that the deniers of the body are no longer Christians, but scientists or salesmen. To be honest, the resistance I just mentioned are personal. I think there are methodological reasons to doubt such a quasi-marketing discourse as the one in my fictional scene, and I wonder, in this way, how can one engage with discourses that seems to be culturally very specific? With these questions going around in my head, as you can see, it's very big. It seems to me that it is not unreasonable to believe that, in a certain sense, at least, part of these discourses is not philosophy, and I think you will understand me if I say that the funny sense I just told might sound like a pyramid scheme. Bring money, friends, we get rich, and maybe in the future we can help you to be healthier and happier. I became interested in this cultural movement not only because its idea seems at first sight naive, but because I saw in it a new place where power would be disputed. And I think I was right. Also, I think the editors were aware of the challenge and responsibility involved in selecting core readings so as not to remain trapped in the cliché of mind-blowing and corporated approaches. I think Jan and Evi in the introduction made it clear that their position is not naive, as they claim that the pedigree that we are able to find here does not emerge from a specific form of philosophy, but rather from a critical post-humanism. It seems to me, with this in mind, that an answer to the question with which I began this presentation, for whom is this book intended, would be, at the very least, for those entities that would wish to enable plural modes of relationship that do not assume a universal and homogenizing paradigm of globalization, and that at the same time go beyond an insulated locality. I'm paraphrasing the description of this event, of course. And after reasoning in this way, I think I understand why this symposium is called Glocal. So, when confronted with this book, I asked myself, but how should I look at it? As an exercise of history of philosophy? I would like to dedicate myself to the history of philosophy. I don't think about creating great ideas. The task of explaining what others have said seems to me be necessary when not everyone has access to the source or language in question. However, again, I believe that this task cannot be naive, as it involves taking important decisions. Evidently, when we carry out an exercise like this, there are added difficulties. We are not studying a dead phenomenon. We are studying thoughts that have just become or remain part of our history. So, I would like to ask Evi and Jan, under what criteria did you coordinate the presentation of the reader's contents? What are the key questions or the fundamental reasons behind the decision to present these contents and no others? I can't help but wonder what is assumed to be valid or a guiding idea every time I'm confronted with a work. So, my intuition is as follows. If one intends to show the core readings that make up bleeding-edge philosophy perspective, and if one of the common motives of these focuses is at least to think about the possibility of a beyond humanism, then a fundamental presupposition that could provide the coherence of this book would be a constant second-order reflexive exercise. Namely, we are faced with a work capable of introducing us to the process of becoming self-aware of our limits, biological, educational, philosophical, as a species. I say the process of becoming self-aware of our limits, because, again, it will be naive to believe that with trans, post, or metahumanist focuses, the task is finished and humanism is effectively overcome. Our existence is still very human. However, I think this is also where one of the advantage of Evi and Jan works lies, because it seems to me that there can be no process of becoming self-aware without including the ability to take a untimely distance from our time on and also from our beliefs. Not only can we be critical of our time, but we also must be critical of ourselves. And that is what surprised me the most about the reader. The coherence of the presentation allows me to read it even a process ranging from a utopian naivety to an awareness of the weakness of the process. I understand in this way that reader starts with an utopian perspective with Huxley, Beta, Moore, Bostrom, and then lands on an anti-species, social, and even democratic one with Pearce, Sandberg, and Hughes. And I think the great advantage of these three last authors is that they no longer write like a businessman. They are philosophers. It's amazing. However, no political stance can be up to the task of our time if it does not at least admit a methodological capable of identifying the limits of humanism that we want to overcome. This is precisely why I think the inclusion of the second part of the reader is so valuable, because there is a clear and a firm revelation of the place of bodies, our bodies, in our understanding of ourselves. Perhaps this is why the event is now called Glocal. I believe that in order to achieve planetary health, as asked in the description of the event, we cannot deny new technologies, but neither we can skip the methodological step of rethinking ourselves. I cannot end this presentation without mentioning one last question that was on my mind when I was reading the reader. The question presented in my review was, could transhumanism overcome its hyperhumanism and renew itself with posthumanism, with posthumanist ideas? It seems to me that Evi and Jan works could also be read under this question, and I see two options for including metahumanism in this book. Option one, Stefan is the editor-in-chief, and his work has to be included. This is a joke, obviously. And option two, I choose that. The brief but powerful ideas included here do indeed allow us to conceive the possibility of moving beyond the very human to reach some aspect of the transhuman, to doubt the ultrahuman, and renew ourselves with the posthuman. Is there one thing I'm sure of, is that we could not attack metahumanism with the epithet of naive or businessman, insofar as their proposals are sincere with the public. That is, they are able to show what the presuppositions of their statement are. Then, finally, I asked, who is this book for? I think for those who are in the process of learning about the basis of currently ethical discussions that could not be approached if we do not illuminate what are the presuppositions behind the relationships we have with everything that exists. Thank you, Evi. Thank you, Jan. You have made a perfect introduction to the urgency of thinking about how we are going to live our future. And now, my level of English is not native, and I make some question. Could I make the question?
Yes, please.
I prefer.
Please.
So I have two for
Jan and
Jan.
Evi are here they're already waiting for the questions and they're eager to respond.
Oh, thank you. I have two for Evi and Jan, one for Jaime and one for Stefan. So I read all or one by one?
Let's start with Jan and Evi.
Okay. I would like to know, Evi and Jan, more about your criteria, about the ideas that were in your mind when you wrote the book. What did you take as your guiding ideas? And for the other hand, I would like to know how you consider your work as work a part of history of philosophy, or maybe you don't like history of philosophy. That's the question for you.
Okay,
Yeah,
who's going to answer? Do you want me to start? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, our criteria. All your questions are very difficult to be answered because I've written everything down while you were asking, and there's so many, but I have to put everything in an order. My criteria have at first been historical. We did need a history of ideas related to transhumanism, posthumanism, and metahumanism. As a continuation of philosophy, as a continuation of cultural history, and as a continuation of political ideas related to our times, especially after the 80s. I cannot bring politics apart. Therefore, I think that our attempt aimed at leading to that integration you have mentioned of transhumanism and critical posthumanism to move, first of all, transhumanism far from naive ideas like mind uploading, etc., and make a point on discussing the political part, first of all. Jan, do you want me to pass?
I would like to agree with Evi that we would like to make a kind of a historical document of the development of the idea. And in this way, it was quite difficult because posthumanists, transhumanists, metahumanists are not only philosophical currents. So we had to include not only a philosophical approach, but also, as Evi said, political perspective, but also technology studies, as you may have noticed, with a bit of an art also included in the book. So because of this wide range of interests and problems, the entire reader was not only a collection of philosophical papers. So in this way, because the reader consists of so many different voices from different subdisciplines and fields, it is addressed to a broader audience, not only to philosophers in our idea.
Thank you.
Yes, and there were so many voices to be included here. And we're sure that we have not put everything in this book. That's why we have been discussing about continuing it. Okay.
I got it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your answer. I hope to edit a book sometime.
A last thing I did not mention is the connection between postmodernism and posthumanism. That we tried to make clear within this historical perspective. Because posthumanism was not born out of nowhere. It came from several and specific at the same time streams of thought.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you both for your answer. Jaime, can I? It seems to me that in your work thinking about power is a nuclear exercise. It could say that you not only think and approach power, but that you offer a very contemporary categories to dealing with power. So I would like to know, and I'm thinking of your texts, The Dance of Becoming and the Metahumanist Manifesto, how your approach to onto hacking differs from what you call minority resistance to the critical posthumanism. I ask this because I feel that perhaps the onto hacking is very close related to the Glocal.
To the
Glocal.
Well, yeah, we would have to discuss what we mean by Glocal, but I think this also relates to a question Marcin has put on the chat, which is whether we can explain the difference between metahumanism and posthumanism. So I could directly go answer both from my perspective, because Stefan has different ones. So we can then. So yeah, it is a complex and tricky issue. I fear I might not be able to summarize it in just a very short time. But let me say that, well, the ideas I was presenting yesterday would imply also this shift from the content to the infrastructure, from the content of a given perception to the actual infrastructure of perception, which means from structure as perceived to the underlying movements that sustain the perception of something as fixed. So it's about a twist to a movement philosophy and pragmatics. It's about a twist from performance to what I call metaformance. So from performing something within an already given set of modes of relation, and the governing mode of relation we have for 600 years already is the fixed point of vision that splits bodies and atrophies bodies. And so my onto hacking turn is then not just performing new content for that given architecture, extremely narrow and reductive architecture of perception, which I would associate to performative strategies, which are anyway needed. I'd say within our pluralistic approach, which is something we totally share, Stefan and me, this has a difference, I defend both. And I also do performative actions of all kinds in my activism or in other contexts. But I focus more on this new kind of take, which proposes to work not on the given content, but on mobilizing a more plastic relational infrastructure, which means bringing back this richer spectrum of the body, which means re-theorizing the body, what a body is and what movement is all together. It's a bit undoing really 2,500 years of metaphysical errors, which have focused on being as fixed, in spite of the very beautiful early attempts of the pre-Socrates that were completely misread thanks to Aristotle.
That's wow. Wow, that's a lot. Thank you, Jaime. You are amazing. Your thoughts are amazing. And last one for Stefan. Can I?
Yes, please.
In the description of the local event, you ask. I don't know if you ask if it is possible today to have some form of care of self. I think in Kurasui. My question is. What do you understand by care of self, and what place does it have in your thinking? I know that Nietzsche can be read therapeutically as an Epicurean philosophy, and I also know that Foucault was interested in the topic of care of self as a form of resistance to the power. So, what place has care of self in your thinking and in your trance or metahumanism?
Yeah, many thanks. Yes, many thanks for the question. I can't give you a comprehensive picture of that. I just want to highlight one specific aspect, which seems to me particularly relevant when talking about the care of self, because in many issues, what we understand as ourselves, what we understand as our wishes, as our desires, as our drives. We often misunderstand ourselves. We don't realize what is sort of the more fundamental desires, drives, wishes, and longings. So, and the care of self is that mindful self-analysis in order to realize, is that something which was culturally established? Is that something which is the result of external power structures, hierarchical power structures, which have created certain desires in me, certain drives in me? Or is that something which is more fundamental to my flourishing, to my fulfillment? And sort of to differentiate, and there are many different drives and drives and instincts and drives and even conflicting ones within me, but some are more to do with my core understanding of who I am, who I want to be, and sort of to get rid of the ones who have been established by means of cultural circumstances is a very tricky endeavor. To realize this is the result of, of me having been on Facebook. This is the result of me having grown up in the European continental context. This is the result of me living as part of within the encrusted relicts of a Christian and Kantian cultural structures. And it is very often the case that these encrusted cultural structures, which go back to a dualist understanding within the Western cultural humanist tradition, they are dominant even in many layers of our cultural surroundings, where we don't even realize how strongly we are still part of that historical dualistic cultural structures, and they affect who we are. They affect our longings, and they create desires. They create higher order desires, and it is very difficult. Is that something which which is more in tune with me, or is it something which is a social expectation? Sort of, if a social expectation, one should take the job with higher, which provides with more money, with a higher salary, with more social recognition. But is that really in tune with what I'm longing to do? Isn't it more important to care of the location where I am, the surroundings, the people I'm surrounding with, the food I eat? Though this is all part of the care of self. Yesterday, I talked about mindfulness meditation, to talk about the interrelationality of the surroundings, social surroundings, personal surroundings in which I'm part of, and sort of to remove the ones which are cultural expectations created by encrusted structures of the past, or by external circumstances. Remove them from who I am, these drives, and focus on the ones which is in tune, which resonates more strongly with me, and care about sort of what do I eat, what is the surroundings, what are the climate, what are the local condition, my social surroundings. And so and this is how I understand sort of this is at least a central element of what I understand of as a care of self in these circumstances. But it's very difficult, actually. Very often you've got desires and you think this is actually important to you, and then once you start analyzing and how they've come about, and to free oneself from cultural expectations, which are in part of all of the cultures we've grown up is, they can be extremely strong, and it can take a long time to realize that this is not promoting your own flourishing, and that you have to move away from it. It can be also very hurtful and difficult to give up certain things you've held on to for a long time, and how to do so. That's why I think sort of mindfulness meditations can be quite an enormous, important task. And also, as a further element, it is to actually stick to what you long for, to hold on to, like the strengthen your will in order to realize, so that it corresponds with your strongest desires, because they don't necessarily, sometimes you realize this is so fundamentally connected to you, but you still don't act accordingly. And that can also be very difficult, because it goes beyond the social expectation, the cultural expectation, the norms in which you live up in, and always going against something needs energy, needs a lot of power and dynamics in order to do so. I hope this sort of at least shed some light on what you've been asking for.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
And there's a wonderful comment, a wonderful short comment by Debika. Care of self is be your own light. Here, I think it can be an abstract.
Wonderful. So I think with coming from Debika,
yes.
we could try to move on to the next speaker and hopefully keep our
Thanks, Nicolás, for that wonderful presentation.
Let me remind everyone that we have half an hour final discussion at the end, so keep all your questions running. There's one coming up. We keep that, please, Camilo, for the end. So now it's a great pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, Marcin Garbowski from Poland. Welcome. We are bringing you in 1 second into the studio.
Hello. Hello. Welcome from Lublin, Poland. So first of all, I wish to thank Stefan, Evi, and Jaime for the opportunity to make some remarks during this fascinating and thought-provoking conference. The initial topic of my speech, which I planned to deliver during the Beyond Humanism conference in Lesbos last year, concerned a reflection on Nick Bostrom's Singleton. For those in the audience less acquainted with Bostrom's work or transhumanist political ideas, one can briefly summarize the idea as an all-encompassing world government, the purpose of which would be to protect humanity, broadly understood, from existential risk, first and foremost, and also to enable the efficient implementation of transhumanist concepts at the same time. As I aspire to look for common ground for transhumanism with classical philosophy, let's say mostly post-Aristotelian concepts, I wanted to elaborate on a model of a singleton, which would include the concept of subsidiarity as a form of mitigating the potential negative aspects of an actually rather totalitarian form of governance. But as with many other things, the circumstances of a pandemic shook up this idea. I would like to say that in my view, the pandemic situation generated an opportunity for various ideologues to test their concepts in a real-world setting. What's more, it tested all of these notions at once. The way I could summarize the results of these tests, on the most part, was careful what you wish for. On the one hand, proponents of nationalism and closed borders received a portion of their dreams come true, with borders being closed in an unprecedented fashion. On the other hand, proponents of environmental-driven austerity got a sneak peek into their proposed utopias, with lockdowns driving pollution down in many parts of the world. When safety from the virus became the highest priority, there was practically no limit put on the interventions imposed by the authorities. In a way, governments and corporations, particularly big pharma and big tech, were declaratively Aristotelian by calling on the common good principle and the necessity to sacrifice desires of the many in order to save the fundamental goods, such as life and health, of the vulnerable few. For many people who are economically, socially, and often mentally stressed by the implemented measures, a question, was it worth it, arose. Although Bostrom singleton was not openly cited, a version of the singleton concept has been openly discussed in the public sphere, with the Great Reset proposed by the World Economic Forum founder Klaus Schwab becoming an inspiration for an array of grand socio-economic programs throughout the developed world. Yet taking into consideration the strife associated with the conditions for presenting such a plan, are we sure we want such a singleton as envisioned by the global elites? Let us assume that this proposal is entirely benevolent in its intentions. Even then, do we feel comfortable unifying humanity in such a top-down manner? What is the key element missing in the equation for us to embrace the scheme, or in fact any large-scale social project? A pandemic is not a war between nations where one side may win and impose an unquestionable moral order. It is a disruptive power where everyone loses to a greater or lesser extent, in the shorter or longer term. And the resource that, as we can now see clearly, is exhausted the most is trust. As in the flash of an explosion, the pandemic crisis highlighted the depletion of trust as one of the most significant fallouts. The trust in governments, the media, experts, or even towards one another has been greatly shaken. Trust is the intangible quality which I believe makes us human to a larger extent than practically any other feature we can name, especially than the ones considered by transhumanists in a sort of very egotistic sort of manner. Without trust, neither is rationality possible in the long run, nor love, nor any other form of constructive reciprocity. Is a world without trust doomed to a nihilistic dog-eat-dog situation? Well, not necessarily. Without trust, a sort of transhumanist dystopia, a world of atomized, or as Jaime would say, atrophied, isolated monads, is technically possible, with an AI overlord maintaining us in a network of solipsistic simulations. But would this be a world we would wish to live in? So thank you for this, for the possibility to give this brief introduction. I hope there will be questions, remarks on your side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcin. Yes, we have 20 or so more minutes for a plentiful discussion.
Why do you address? You've been fascinated by the singleton for quite some time, because you think it is something worth aspiring for. Why do you think these are sort of that could be a realistic solution as a type of political structure?
Well, I don't claim in the long run it's realistic, but if we take serious all the notions, albeit anthropocentric in a way, notions of transhumanism, then in the long run, a singleton type of entity is necessary in order to sort of mitigate the dangers which arise not only, let's say, from the natural world, or meaning like cosmological or cosmic catastrophes, or somehow provoked by us, like climate change, but also from the threats that we pose as a species to ourselves, right? By way of nuclear conflicts, or a runaway sort of malevolent Skynet AI sort of situation. So some form of control in the form of a government will be necessary. This is in this introduction, I didn't mention it, but another sort of issue connected with the singleton and with the expansion of the transhumanist project is obviously space colonization. You can't, if the objective is to prevent harm to not only humans, but all life on Earth, if we want to preserve the various species that are here. So, in a sort of indefinite term, we also need to expand into space, as Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos and so on want to. Probably Jaime would say that this is a form of hubris and so on, but, well, self-preservation, which lies at the foundations of basically this ideology of transhumanism, is I think a notion which permeates throughout all living organisms. The fact that we have the capacity to expand further than our planet is, well, one could say it's our cosmic endowment.
May I jump in?
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, I think I often accuse those who want to really do this cosmic view, escape of a true cosmological ignorance. I mean, one should study just basic cosmology to understand that the only cosmic medium we will ever have is the Earth. I mean, the Voyager 2 space probe will arrive in the nearest star. It will take as long as the Sapiens has been on Earth to arrive only at the nearest star where no available planet is for us to live. A slightly longer trip in just our galaxy will take as long as the universe has existed. I mean, it's just ridiculous, you know. It's really cosmological ignorance, which I accuse transhumanistic visions of body despising, of not knowing what the body is, of not knowing what our self is as a body, as an embodied self, proprioception. People, and now this is going a bit astray from what you were saying, but let's say people who wish to do away with their bodies, they should also correct their radical ignorance about what a body and a self is. They should read, for example, Oliver Sacks', the famous book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Head. Chapter 3 is about the disembodied lady. It's the case of a person who lost all proprioception. It's very well written in that chapter, the way in which that person lost all sense of self, all sense of world. And there was no way she could recuperate it ever. Which means, there's no self and world without a body. There's no mind and thinking without a body. And this radical ignorance needs to be completely reverted. So this kind of ontological hacking is what I normally propose. And in terms of space colonization, it's just the same problem. It's always about, escaping in this nihilistic drive to self-destruction and destruction, you know, going from one planet to the other. So for me, that's pure, yeah, not just hybrid, but nihilism. It's the worst form of destruction and self-destruction. But then, just another comment on the singleton. I often also think that, as I mentioned yesterday, many of the imaginations that are projected in transhumanism are far behind the current realities we have in our pockets. I think what we yet need to understand is the new modes of algorithmic governmentality that are nowadays being implanted deeply and literally by the deep way in which we are entangled with increasingly autonomous and absolutely unfathomable planetary scale computation systems and big data networks. That is, for me, the big phenomenal challenge for which we need to renew our whole understanding of what power is, of what relations are, what kind of entanglement we are entering into this. And that is the real new type of governmentality that is already being put in place for quite some time. So rather than thinking, you know, we should try to renew much more deeply our understanding of what is already going on, which is far more advanced than those imaginations.
If I may add to this comment, actually, do you want to respond first? Yes.
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 Marcin, do you...
So, firstly, I would like to say that to a large extent, I agree with you, Jaime. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I agree. I agree with you to a large extent because my skepticism in form of scientism, so to speak, as you know, this epitome of the Enlightenment. Indeed, I have gained quite a bit of skepticism towards it, and also for some of the reasons that you mentioned, like not acknowledging some of the intangible qualities of which cannot be calculated, computed, and so on in an easy way, such as our core value have between each other. So I agree with you, but on the other hand, I would say that a large part of the world, especially, let's say, the corporate establishment and scientific establishment, doesn't really care about it, and it seems that they don't care about it even more now than they did before. Some of the I'm big. What form of sort of transhumanism is presented by the corporate world, so to speak. On a side note, I think that this remark on the technical limitations of space travel, it's not a very strong argument if you know, governments or corporations will want to seriously colonize this space and not only use it as a pretext to sort of impose power on the population. I know that this will sound close to, you know, conspiracy theories, but there is obviously an interpretation of transhumanism that it's basically like a PR strategy for the big tech corporations and governments, and what they want to actually implement has nothing to do with the improvement of life for most of humanity, but basically corporate profit gains.
if I may join in, step in, because this is so. Firstly, I need to. It is important to hear these voices. It's important to acknowledge that, you know, because many people have still such a humanist, hyper-humanist understanding of the world, and the singleton is exactly such a notion which goes into that direction. It is a representation of a hyper-humanism which I regard as extremely dangerous. It is part, and the same author who sort of to whom it goes, the notion can be traced. Also, in the Posthuman Studies reader, has got a text defending utopia, which I regard as dangerous as a notion like the singleton. It's a way. It is the utopia in the sense. It is here. It is something aspired for, which is sort of the good structure. It's again the notion, the good between the evil. There's one structure which is supposed to be aimed for, and all the rest, and that will solve all of our problems. It undermines any kind of diversity which we're surrounded with, which we're encountered with, and in order to realize it's a notion of a utopia, and the same author sort of defends the notion of the utopia and the importance of as a utopia. I'm a strongly anti-utopian thinker. Whenever I hear the notion of any utopia, this is supposed to be aspired for, I feel my body reacting to it, because of maybe also partly because of, you know, with my German heritage origin, I understand sort of any utopia so far, at least with our historical background of utopias. It has always been the case. People, leaders present the utopia, and the followers, and everything needs to be sacrificed in order to realize and gain that utopia. So the people living at the moment are being instrumentalized, are being used in order to realize the future, which will never be realized, which will never be put into practice. So it's basically a sacrification of the flourishing of lives of people who are currently living here on Earth, on all the great varieties of people, of animals, of different organic entities and non-organic entities. And I find that extremely dangerous and really representation of that hyper-humanist way of thinking. I think it's important to reject any kind of utopia, to do, and that's what I'm trying to do, a very pragmatic account. Look at the various instances, try to find a solution, try to find a deal with factory farming, try to find a new way of gaining energy. And this is why, and it's important to take these notions into consideration, because I know there is a widely shared tendency to embrace them. But I'm doing all my best in order to show how highly dangerous any kind of these final solutions and utopias are. One can have visions, one can have contingent nodal points, which one presents as solutions, but any kind of utopia and perfect world government is extremely dangerous, and I'm doing my best in order to prevent them from coming about.
Okay, 2 points, if I may. One is that I think what is understood as hyperhumanism, the sort of basically self-centered, focus on certain qualities such as intelligence, longevity, and so on, and basically pumping it up to the extreme, is part of a rather sort of primitive Darwinian perspective, meaning like the self-preservation, the ground level of the Maslow pyramid. And what I think we're generally trying to aspire to, the sort of relationality, reciprocity, and what I was mentioning as, you know, as trust being an important feature within it, that's the thing that I would say is that is the real humanism, or at least the one that we should. Maybe it hasn't been pronounced, but it should be, because wait, just the second thing. which Jaime might pick on. I noticed that in certain sort of like environmentalist focused post-human approaches, there is also a notion of human exceptionalism, only, let's say, the negative form of human exceptionalism, that humanity is a significant moral agent within reality that is a disruptive element within it, as if, you know, as if the same thing were done by let's say termites or, I don't know, dolphins. So then it would be totally okay, or at least neutral in a way, because that's how nature functions. Okay,
yeah.
So.
No, very briefly, may I just clarify what I mean by hyperhumanism, because I've been proposing this concept for many years. You can see it actually in the reader since the first paper, and for me it's a complex, slightly more complex idea that it can be perfectly exemplified through Facebook. So what I mean by hyperhumanism is a double-edged way of inflating the worst aspects of humanism while at the same time radically undermining them. So, for instance, Facebook picks up on this egocentrism of the individual that wants to conquer the world, to expose itself to the world, to be constantly exposing its, becoming data, but also controlling the others, right? So it expands this dream of the autonomous individual kind of projecting itself forever. But this is just the kind of lure to, I mean, the real profile will never be the one you make of yourself. It's this hidden profile that the autonomous algorithms are creating of your behavior that is sold to third parties in what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, where we are the products that are sold. And for these algorithms, we are no longer individuals. We are what Deleuze was already calling in 1990, individuals, some data samples of population behaviors. This is already the truth of what is going on. So, you know, many times when you talk about humanism and so forth, we're forgetting how things have already shifted completely. So the hyperhuman is this kind of complex double game by which the worst of humanism is inflated just for the purpose of undermining it radically at the same time as we have already we are already radically, you know, post-human samples of information in algorithmic data systems.
The worst parts of humanism or the worst parts of human condition?
Is there a difference? I mean, I don't believe that the human ever existed. It's just a fallacy of colonialism, from my point of view. It's a completely blown up construct of colonialism. There's no other means, just like for binary sex, it never had other meaning than creating power differentials. Creating the species of the human as distinct and superior never had another meaning than domination of the planet.
I would like to address a comment from Ioana Stamati. She's asking that we tend to forget Earth is a part of our body. The general question is more of, are we humans? Are we as humans a parasite for the Earth? Or are we a virus? So I think that this... So I think that this is also posing the issue not in an anthropocentric fashion, because why do we consider viruses evil? Because they harm us. So, but from the perspective of the virus, they are simply replicating their DNA or RNA and using the means which are possible. So if we detach, the same thing with parasites. These are axiologically laden, value-laden terms, which are very anthropocentric from the beginning. And if we want to have like a clear meta-humanistic approach, we also need to analyze these terms as things that remain in our, as you would say, humanistic mindset.
I agree with you, Marcin, in that respect. And I can see there is, and because there is some critical posthumanists whose names I don't mention here, who sort of seem to suggest that it would be best if humans vanished entirely from Earth. And I regard this as problematic as ideas which suggest that there is like a singleton could be a utopian answer to the challenges we're currently facing. That's why I think we need to find, middle ground. We need to take discourses into consideration. But so, yeah, many thanks for highlighting this issue, and we will discuss it further in the final discussion part. And because now the half an hour is already over, and we will discuss it further then. So many thanks again to you, Marcin, and Jaime, and we'll present our next speaker.
Good, great, thanks, Marcin. And now it's a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Leo Igwe, who is joining us from Nigeria. Welcome back to the forum, Leo.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yami and other colleagues, for this opportunity. Yes, it has been an interesting discussion. And as usually the case, I ask myself, how does this relate to the African continent? Yeah, how does this relate to? And when I mean Africa now, I don't mean the color. I mean, how does it relate to this region? Because these courses have mainly focused on the West and largely ignoring the continent of Africa. Of course, this overwhelming attention on Western societies could be attributed to the fact that countries in the West have been at the forefront of cutting-edge innovations as we know them. Yeah, but technologies impact individual and collective lives. And they shape the development of countries and societies beyond the Western Hemisphere. So the influence of technology is both local and global, national and cosmic. So it is not just an influence that is located to a particular part of the world. Yeah, technologies have succeeded in helping human beings overcome certain limitations and existentially encumbering circumstances and challenges. Technologies have phenomenally linked and transformed various sectors of human life and economy and the world, connecting countries and regions and continents in ways that have never been the case. And at the same time, applications of technology have put, of course, human beings, planet, life as we know it at so much risk. Now, existing debates have noted how these emerging innovations have transformed and shaped the ideas of humans, including the futures of human beings, non-human, and the planet. Encapsulated in post-trans metahumanistic approaches, these conversations have highlighted mainly Western or Eurocentric perspectives. They've addressed pressing questions and forged outlooks and perspectives on human-technology relationship based on changes and situations in Europe and America. Now, there is very little or no mention of Africa, African situations and circumstances. Now, I want to look at what I call the African glocalities and low globalities. By that, I mean, technologies constitute a key factor and driver of African growth and development, and is a silent instrument in envisioning and re-envisioning Africa. Now, when I say it now, I don't mean Africa as just a thing, or we could rather say envisioning and re-envisioning the world from an African situation or African standpoint, and imagining and reimagining the world and the cosmos from an African standpoint in this 21st century. So it's pertinent to explore the connection between emerging technologies and visions of Africa, or visions of the world from Africa, or visions of the world from Africans, African futures and ecologies, both in its local, global, glocal, and what I call the low global ramifications, because it is important to bring an African perspective to discuss this critical of glocality, what is contained in the abstract as the universalistic and homogenizing paradigm of globalization that's in contention with isolated local realities. But I also think it's important to also look at what I call low globality, because too often what we associate as universal or as homogenizing paradigm is localized, is something that originates, in a particular context. Now, my contention is that it is in teasing out the global or global strands and proclivities of human technology intersections and relationships that an African perspective could productively and meaningfully be brought to bear on existing debates. In other words, here we have all these emerging technologies. How do they relate to the African living situation? And how does African living situation relate with these technologies? Now, technologies emerge and are emerging within a social-cultural context, economic, political situations. And these dynamics, they shape and influence how technology humans are perceived, are represented, how they interact. So, I mean, if I should say, if we're gonna have that transhuman phenomenon or stage, it's gonna be something that is shaped and situated within certain political, social, and economic situation. So in response to existential challenges, humans, the tool-making beings, forge and deploy technologies to conquer and take control of the environment, themselves and others. And the relationship has yielded a situation that has increasingly blurred the lines demarcating humans and technology. So the question now is, how do we relate to this situation? So emerging technologies have presented radical options about evolution of human and possible futures. So scholars have debated, weighed in, and tried to engage these visions of the future as we saw in the Posthuman reader. So how does the debate relate to the African situation? Now, in the face of the fact that Africa is often presented and represented as a basket case, framed in somber, despairing terms, as a byword for poverty, as a region afflicted by unyielding state of misery and despair. How does one weigh into the transposed meta-humanist debates? How does one capture this African situation in a way that brings to the table of debate something unique, particular, or something African, as the case may be? Now, given that the continent is bedeviled by systemic abuse and exploitation, endemic and pandemic outbreaks, complicated wars and conflict, migration crisis, weak state structures, dysfunctional institutions, there is an inclination to think that transhumanism, as Francis Fukuyama noted, is a dangerous idea for Africa, or that these emerging technologies could create or complicate the African situation, or create dystopic scenarios of epic proportion. And of course, such projections could be a reason, to shrink, to move away from embracing emerging technologies. However, the African predicament, pervasive poverty, unyielding state of misery and despair, systematic abuse and exploitation, endemic and pandemic outbreaks, and other crises could be traced to lack of or limited applications of technology, so that hope, progress could be predicted for the African continent only in situations where African governments put in place sound and robust policies and programs that could enable the use of emerging technologies to defeat diseases, mitigate suffering, realize qualitative lifespan, and a secular paradise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leo. I think yesterday we were partly tackling some of the problems that you mentioned in terms of even my proposal of the trash humanism that is implying always this systemic exploitation, which one can even ask the deep question of whether this type of technological development, such as transhumanism proposes, could it ever become something that is not based on systemic exploitation? This is a serious question I launch for everyone today. Does anyone think that this type of technological development could ever arrive to a point that it is not entirely relying on this double-sided exploitation I was mentioning yesterday through my concept of the trash human, of atrophied bodies and of planetary systemic exploitation, particularly Africa? I was mentioning how digital waste from the West is covering Africa with trash, right? Of course, how Africa has been abused over centuries of colonialism. And I was also mentioning, like, you know, how much we can learn from further away pasts, like, you know, the incredible wealth of tribal cultures in Africa, the sapiens coming from Africa, all the incredible wealth of body intelligences that have existed in African cultures. How could one learn from them also in our current concept? Again, James Sussman, the anthropologist, speaks about, you know, we can learn a lot about, you know, gatherer cultures before agriculture arrived in Africa, especially, how much of a better living perhaps they had and less anxious one. Anyway, just a few provocations, hopefully others join the discussion.
Leo, do you want to comment on Jaime's reflection, or otherwise I might? Leo?
Well, the only thing I can say here is that I don't see this idea that, okay, the solutions, the impact of technology can just happen without human influences and interventions. I'm of the view that how technologies are applied to address human problems, they are all linked to human interests and intentions. And it is in this intersection we are going to situate our hopes and optimism in terms of how the impact of these technologies as predicted and as projected, or even how their risks are going to be mitigated. Yes, because when we say, okay, Africa has become dumping sites of digital waste, some people are responsible. These digital wastes are not just falling from the skies. And some people are instrumental to this situation. So I've always been of the view that at the end of the day, these emerging technologies are in the hands of those driven by interest. And it is, but this is not a situation where we should just resign and say, yes, like now the situation that, oh, Africa is worse off and remains that way. No. It is important that we understand this and move into what I call the technopolitics, you know, and look at how technologies are being used for political means and see how we can address that. You know, yes, this digital waste, we could also respond to it. African governments could respond to it and said, no, we don't want this. Or they can put in place programs to counteract that in one form or another. So while I understand, you know, the impact this is having on the region, but we shouldn't resign to it. You know, I think there's a need for us to begin to engage these forces and factors that have created this situation. And let us not forget that, you know, one of the main concepts, you know, in this discussion is trans, which is ability to go over. So we should begin to look at how do we put in place programs that can enable us transcend this situation of Africa equals to digital waste, forgotten continent, nothing is going on there. So if we, if human beings have been able to forge technologies, or we have gotten to the point where technologies is transforming human lives or human situations, and the boundary between technologies and humanity is blurring, we should also look at how to use technology in quotes, or how we can be technologized to the extent of overwhelming these situations and stereotypes that have been associated with Africa for a long time.
Let me expand on that thought, and I want to raise some issues. What sort of on technopolitics and what you've just mentioned. So I've you know, we all see the rise of China. China has now more peer-reviewed. Chinese scholars have more peer-reviewed publications than U.S. American scholars. Sort of the salaries go up, financial economic flourishing occurs in China, and I think it seems to be sort of that financial success is unstoppable in the near future. As a consequence, I also recognize with the New Silk Road the developments, and in particular also the investments in various countries in Africa, and also investigated sort of as part of the pandemic crisis how many vaccines were donated to various countries in Africa as a way of gaining more influence but it was not just that. And so sort of the initial response was, well, what's the technopolitical interest for China with respect to these moves? And the initial suggestion or idea was probably exploitation of soil or something must be underlying idea. I looked into that further, but actually this does not seem to be, I'm not excluding the possibility, but that doesn't seem to be the dominant reason for this strategic move from China. Actually, more fundamental reason seems to be actually the salaries are so high in China that they need places where, you know, the technological infrastructure, technological devices get built. And this seems to be the hope that this be done in selected African countries. As a consequence, they also have to build infrastructure, create a digital infrastructure, promote it further, and also to promote the education in the local communities in order to get the employment in these companies which are being created. On the other hand, some critics say, well, this is a neo-colonial approach, it destroys local cultures. But on the other hand, it seems to be, well, actually, it provides a lot of education and new jobs based on the Chinese political model, which we can all see, you know, very critical. But on the other hand, it seems to provide people with education and jobs and financial stability, maybe also promote further sort of biotech technologies in these various regions where the investment takes place. So I can see that it could be actually quite beneficial for well-being and for also more educative and financial flourishing. And I'm curious how you these developments, what do you think about these reflections? How worried are you, yes, or how hopeful?
You see, in looking at China relationship with Africa, well, the thing is worried and hopeful at the same time. Okay, but it is important we ask ourselves, where are African governments in this? Whether China, relationship with China, relationship with Europe, relationship with Asia, relationship, it is actually where are African governments? Yes, where are they? And what are their stakes? Okay, now there's this notion about the fact that China built the African Union headquarters. They built it in Addis Ababa, and some people of the view that they have put in place there a lot of gadgets, technologies, which they use to spy and collect information, you know, and all that. Yes, it can be seen from that perspective. Another perspective is, of course, what sounds like a very optimistic, very positive outlook, what you try to paint in terms of making these technologies available, and also trying to encourage education and trying to step up in terms of technical knowledge of people and all that. Now, but whether the future will be dictated by maybe this kind of very suspicious, distrustful idea about China's involvement in Africa, or the positive outlook you have tried to paint, it depends on African governments how they engage this relationship. It will not be dictated completely by China. It will never happen, because it is important that in the table of that relationship, African governments would be there to say and make sure that they tailor or their relationship with China towards these needs, towards this positive outlook you have painted. So otherwise, I mean, tomorrow there might be cases where some of them cannot pay back their debt. And of course, the Chinese government will come and seize their airports and seize sometimes the president's house, you know, because they built it. And all that. So what I'm saying there is that there are other possible scenarios, you know, in terms of China involvement in Africa, but it's left for African countries to be in the position to bring to the table needs and their own interests, to be sure that the very dystopic or the very, you know, dark and gloomy picture or prospects, they don't materialize. So it depends on Africa and how they get back to China in this relationship.
And they don't only buy the African ports or airports, they've also bought the port in Pearce, in Athens. So they're expanding everywhere.
Well,
so,
but I mean, I think it is fairly obvious that there is a Chinese program to do an unprecedented kind of conquering of the world. And this is very related to the recently approved policy that every Chinese family should have 3 children instead of 1. Don't forget this very, very, very significant issue, related, of course, also to what has happened in the pandemic and the virus coming from there and so forth. So it is fairly obvious. Now, do we want to be world governed? I mean, maybe instead of the singleton, we will have the Changleton, right? Chinatown. Are there? Do we want to be governed? No, this is a very serious problem. Do we want to be governed by a government that is imposing this social credit system, this social scoring system with the unprecedented facial recognition and so forth, with the concentration camps for all the Muslims in the east, in the western side, and so forth? I mean, this is coming up. This is coming up, but it's coming up together with other kinds of dynamics, which are also beyond our reach, which is what I mentioned previously about the kind of autonomous algorithmic management that is being established already. So I think all of this is already beyond our humanistic imaginations. So, yeah.
And that's why we need a post-humanistic perspective. Yes, indeed. And if the pandemic has been the last act of universal capitalism, as we already know it. As Stefan has already mentioned, the experiment goes further than Africa. Africa is a deeply hurt continent, but the experiment is everywhere. I come from a country that became an experiment for some years and still is, for example. So I want to believe that posthumanism is about to overcome these perspectives and these obstacles. I don't know how, but critical thinking as the core of critical posthumanism may bring people together and may broaden the horizons of their thoughts. Because this is critical posthumanism for me, and it can be an answer to a series of political problems all over the world, and be an answer to what we think we don't share. We share a lot of problems, actually.
And Leo, I would like to add that I'm a great admirer of this term low globality, because it inverts a vector. Initially, we have glocalism as a basic term, and I believe that initially it reflects. It should reflect two directions, from global to local and from local to global. But for me, it's becoming more and more one direction from global to local, and locality seems to be very often the negative effect of globalism. So your approach is opposite, and it's great. And for me, in relation to posthumanism, we could say that if we take the perspective of glocalism, posthumanism is easy to apply as a critical posthumanism of all of these negative effects. But at the same time, if we take this low global perspective, we can try to offer a more positive program for posthumanism. So I really like this approach that you've expressed in your talk. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have 5 minutes left. There are a couple of questions in the chat.
Should I,
by Marcin.
I will. This is one question which was raised in the. Well, there are a couple of questions raised in the chat. So.
Yeah. It says, hasn't the West started looking at technology in a magical way, basically forgetting from where its initial civilization advantage came from? What is the lesson for Africa and the global South? Yeah. When one talks about magical way, because I'm in religious studies, so I always have issues with that. But I can relate with that within the context of transhumanism, in the sense that maybe we are getting to see what confounds our own predictions and projections. What is the lesson for Africa and the global South? The fact there is that, of course, there has always been this idea that when you talk about the magical impact of technology, you talk about the West. It's associated with the West and Western leadership. And Africans are observers. We're just there to watch the West. They go to the moon, they go to Mars, they explore the world, they come out with discoveries and all that. So, but I don't want always to be in this question of bemoaning this, like a crying baby, always they are crying, oh, they're doing this. It is important we ask ourselves, how do we get into the game of magical technology? How do we participate? How do we contribute? For instance, the pandemic, what we have is a pandemic. So there should be some sort of research going on here, or some kind of collaboration on how to get out, in quote, that magic, that could bring out, like as we have seen in the vaccine. So for me, the lesson there is important for us to understand that it is, we could be part and parcel of this magical experiment. We could be part and parcel of this magical experience. That's the way I look at it. And we should not always be looking at it as in, oh yeah, they are there and we are here, coming out with these technologies, while for us here, we are just on the fringe of life. So for me, it's about getting to the table of that magical technology, being part of it. Just as we are here today, bringing different perspectives to a particular topic, it's important that we get to that table, contribute, and bring our own input, to this, this project of this magical project of emerging technology and its impact or their impact. Yeah.
And also by taking further sort of the movements already occurring into consideration. For example, Afrofuturism is an extremely important movement, it seems to me, which is something which in a further reader should also find its appropriate space when it comes to the post-human discourses, no? And I'm sure there are many others which haven't been recognized and perceived as intensely as Afrofuturism has already reached that widely shared acknowledgement or awareness. But there are many others too, no? So Yes, the half an hour is already over, and we will continue with the reflections in the very last final discussion page. And so I will many thanks, Leo. I will remove you, and and Azal and Jaime will present our next speaker.
Yes, so thanks so much, Leo. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our final speaker of the day and of the forum, who is Katherine Hayles, who is one of the foundational authors of our field and also present in the reader. So welcome back to our events, Katherine. It's such a great pleasure to see you once more.
Well, thank you very much, Jaime. And I've been listening in on this fascinating discussion, and I'm very pleased to be able to share some ideas with you today. So I've prepared a PowerPoint, and I'll try to get that up on the screen for us.
I think you need to choose not the general window, but the other that we tried the other day.
Okay, let's see here. I can get that.
PowerPoint. Take your time. It's no hurry. If you have it open in the background, it will be available in principle for choosing it.
No, that didn't work, did it?
Oh, that's a nice effect.
Let's see, how do I get out of this one?
No hurries. This is but it is there. I see it. Yeah, if you put it, maybe, select it and then go straight into the...
Okay, are we set now? Can you see that?
I will remove
all right.
myself.
Well, this topic will be familiar to you all because in one way or another, I think many speakers have already addressed this idea of that we're going in the wrong direction, and how is it that we might be able to affect what I call a planetary reversal. And I'll be focusing today on a new framework I've been thinking about that I call ecological reciprocity, and contrasting that with liberal humanism. So I'll be working primarily from two texts, Lisa Lowe's The Intimacies of Four Continents and Stanley Robinson's new novel called Ministry for the Future. So the problem in a nutshell, I think many speakers have referred to, that we know we're going in the wrong direction, but why is it that we continue to act in counterproductive ways? And one way to think about this problem is what I call the kinship problem, the nearly universal human tendency to favor one's own family, clan, community, or region over others. And one way this is often expressed is as a free riding version. Why should I change and give others the advantage? We were just talking about China, and in the US, this is often phrased as, why should we institute strict pollution controls and give China the advantage? So that's the kinship problem. And Lisa Lowe does a structural analysis of this kind of problem. Her time period is roughly 1750 to 1850, and she talks about the promises of political liberalism, its promise of universal rights, emancipation, wage labor, free trade, and so forth. But as she argues, this does not overcome the kinship problem, but only raises it to a higher scale, that is, to citizenship in a nation state. So she summarizes, modern liberalism defined the human and universalized its attributes to European man. It simultaneously differentiated population in the colonies as less than human. And one of her instances is John Stuart Mill, who at the same time he was penning his pamphlet on liberty, was also writing apologies for the East India Company and its colonial policies. And her argument is that the relation here is not merely correlative, but actually causal, that a kind of zero-sum game is in effect, where the leisured lifestyle and privileged class system of some is possible only because of the enslavement and the indentured labor of others. And we certainly see this in U.S. history, slavery in the plantation system, for example, or indentured Chinese and their role in the expansion of railroads. Enormous fortunes made on the one hand, on the other, people's lives lived in abject misery. So I'll ask, is the kinship problem really unsolvable? And is the situation still a zero-sum game? And I'd like to argue that no, it's not unsolvable, that things have changed considerably since 1850. And among those are the huge advantages of computational media and technical media as labor, which is increasingly the case in factories and so forth. So it opens the possibility for a new kind of enlarged and corrected version of political liberalism that I call ecological reciprocity. So here are just some key points. Instead of the autonomous self imagined by political liberalism, you have the enmeshed self, the embodied, embedded self with multiple ties to humans, non-humans, and technical media. Instead of capitalism, you have cooperative ventures. Instead of free trade, global cooperation. Instead of a sovereign citizen with rights, an empathic, responsible citizen. Instead of a rational actor so dear to economic theory, you have cognitive assemblages of humans, non-humans, and technical media. Instead of free agent and free will, you have distributed agency and distributed cognition flowing throughout the cognitive assemblages. Instead of global capitalism, capitalism that's tied to the planet's health. And instead of only humans, humans, non-humans, and technical media, all as cognitive agents. So Peter Haff gives some insight, I think, into the kinship problem in his provocative article, Humans and Technologies in the Anthropocene, 6 Rules. And he places a great deal of emphasis on scale, which we can call the micro. For example, the computer components in this computer showing the screen now, the meso, the human scale, and the macro, very large scale systems. And one of his rules is the rule of inaccessibility, which is to say that a significant difference in size between two systems implies that the larger system cannot influence the smaller system, and vice versa. And anyone who has tried to contact his or her legislator on behalf of some piece of legislation knows the difficulty of communicating between the meso and the macro scale. And he emphasizes that what we as humans often ignore is that we are components of a larger sphere, that is the technosphere, that they did not design, do not control, and from which they cannot escape, which is a very pessimistic view of the situation. And this is sort of reinforced by what he calls the rule of impotence, that is that the mesoscale systems are generally unresponsive to the stratum 1 parts, the micro, by virtue of constraints applied to enforce organization. That is because if a large system responded sensitively to every fluctuation of the scale beneath it, it would lose its organizational integrity. So as a contra example, he gives a Navy ship. A Navy ship is a design system where all of the different levels can interact efficiently. The captain control the ship. He's at the meso scale. The ship is at the macro scale. But because of traditions of the captain being the sole authority, as well as all the communication devices within the ship and so forth, it's able to operate effectively across all three scales. So with this insight, we can now rephrase the kinship problem, that bloodlines, traditions, laws are all at the mesoscale, and the problem is how to connect with the macro scale, global warming, species extinction, etc. And Jan was just talking about the local and the global. So this is asking, how can we invent or create the linking mechanisms that would allow the integration of these different levels? And Kim Stanley Robinson picks up on a suggestion that was made by Dalton Chen in 2008, the invention of carbon coins, verified through blockchain verification. And what Chen suggested was that a single carbon coin represents the service of preventing 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent from entering the atmosphere. So you could earn a carbon coin by, if you're an oil company, keeping the oil in the ground instead of excavating it for a century. You might earn a carbon coin by a direct drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the form of dry ice, and so forth. So how do these function as currencies? Well, we know that after 1971 in the US, money was no longer backed by gold or silver, but only, quote, the full faith and credit of the US government. And it works, as Jakob Goldstein points out in his nonfiction book, Money. Money only works because we all agree to believe in it. Money is a fiction. So carbon coin then is a new kind of money, a new kind of quantitative easing. And Robinson imagines that if it can be issued by the central banks of Europe, UK, China, and the US, it would have a guaranteed interest rate, a floor beneath which it would not fall, and that it could trade in its own market and against other currencies. So then the question is, how do you actually get something like carbon coins to work? And in his fictional novel, this is done through the work of Mary Murphy, who's the head of the Ministry for the Future, an organization established by the UN Accords. And Mary's interlocutor is Frank Lay, an aid worker who was the sole survivor of a massive heat wave in India. So Mary's argument to both the central banks and to the energy company is that carbon coins in effect is a strategy for, as she says, going long on civilization. Instead of betting on strategies that lead to the crash of civilizations, bet on strategies that harness the energies of capitalist investment, but now leading to the planet's health instead of its destruction. And this is combined in Robinson's fiction with what he calls the war for the earth. So he acknowledges that the people who are espousing energy destructive policies are not necessarily villains. He says they will be good people, patriotic politicians concerned for the fate of their beloved nation's citizens, conscientious, hardworking corporate executives, men for the most part, well-educated, well-meaning. They will want the best for their children. In other words, the kinship problem writ large. But opposing them now is a terrorist group that's calling themselves Children of Kali. And their rationale is they're killing us, so we are killing them. And Robinson posits this idea of ethical terrorism. Is it an oxymoron, or could it in fact in some sense work? So there's a strain of schizophrenia running through this text. On the one hand, there's the war for the earth and the rationales offered in the text for that. On the other hand, in the Ministry for the Future, one of the staff members says, the rule of law is all we've got. So the Ministry for the Future chief of staff decides to institute a black wing, that is a terrorist organization covertly operating under the ministry while preserving plausible deniability for the ministry herself. And this is an example of how the text handles this idea of ethical terrorism. But it's only up to a point. After several targeted assassinations have been carried out, the text arranges a spokesperson in India to confront the children of Kali, and he argues that it was strategic up to a point, but now it must stop. Even Kali didn't kill just to kill, he says, and certainly no human should, while acknowledging at the same time he has been part of the war for the earth, saying, I am Kali. So now we have, going back to the idea of ecological reciprocity, now we can see the linking mechanisms suggested in this text that might actually make it work. What are the linking mechanisms for the enmeshed self? This idea of cognitive assemblages, the collectivities through which information, interpretation, and meaning circulate, that the many relations implied by an enmeshed self can be brought to the local level through the idea of climate disasters that affect everyone. Global cooperation is linked to both the Paris Accords and the Ministry for the Future in this text. Responsible citizens have a black wing, the war for the earth. Cognitive assemblages are enforced at a technological level through a new kind of banking system called Eurlock that is distributed and depends on blockchain verification. And capitalism is tied to the planet's health through carbon coins. So in effect, then, this novel itself is a linking mechanism to allow us to imagine how we might move from a planet negative trajectory onto a planet positive trajectory. Thanks, and with this I'll conclude the PowerPoint and stop the screen share.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the presentation. We have 15 minutes to focus on questions for you, and then a final discussion with everyone for half an hour, so we have a bit of time.
So we can directly, many thanks for that wonderful presentation. And we directly have a question from the YouTube stream. From Marcin. Isn't attributing features like health to the planet a form of anthropomorphizing? Perhaps we should treat human activity like any other geological processes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, etc.
Well, thank you, Martin, for that provocative intervention there. But I would say that if we're going to get ourselves out of this mess, it's absolutely crucial that we have measures of how anthropogenic climate change is progressing so that we actually know where we are and we can know if we're making progress. So things like measuring the amount of particles in the air, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is crucial to a scientifically oriented approach. And I don't think that we should think of human activity as like a volcanic eruption, because a volcanic eruption is a material process. It's the resultant of all the forces acting on it. But what distinguishes human action is that we have intentions, we can make plans, and we can make decisions about what we do. The volcano can't make any decisions, but as cognitive actors, we as humans certainly can, and we can make better decisions or worse decisions. So I'm, of course, arguing that the health of the planet can be measured scientifically by things like the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that it should guide us to make better decisions, not worse ones.
May I just jump in also in reply to Marcin, since I was yesterday doing my own defense of my concept of planetary health, which I am also lately promoting a lot. And why should health be just a human question? I don't quite get that point. I mean, health, of course, is also in any sort of non-human animal, but then I think quite clearly one can understand how the biosphere as a kind of organism, which is something more complex than an organism, implies also a renewal of the concept of health, which is probably not the same one that we apply to a human body. But why should health be human? I would ask Marcin in reverse, so to speak.
But as he cannot, well, he cannot reply no. So
let's maybe keep just the whole thing going.
Maybe later on in the final discussion.
The final discussion.
Yes. We can bring up this issue again. Maybe a critical sort of issue concerning when you talk about this reciprocity as a way to move away from liberalism. And I'm wondering, well, sort of these type of reciprocal connection also seem to remind of like being part of a communal structure, being part of a traditional family structure. You're not the one who makes a decision because you are like a monad, like an ethical entity separate from the others, but because of your connection with the others, because of the way you interact, you're embedded in the relations. So you are treated because you are the daughter of someone, because someone has obligations or roles and function, because the person is a father and has a certain role. But that could also have problematic, or cannot this also have quite some problematic paternalistic implications? I'm just imagining, for example, in the Chinese social credit system, it was the case, for example, there was where we also have such implications. There was a young boy who applied to university, and he fulfilled all criteria, but he was not accepted because his father didn't pay back the debt to the bank. So even though he fulfilled all obligations to enter university, he was not allowed to enter because of something his father did. And I'm wondering, in the system you're suggesting, couldn't like analogous challenges also arise, because you're not to be judged on the basis of your actions, but on the way you're interconnected within your communal structure?
Well, it's interesting, Stefan, that you would make that argument in terms of kinship structures, since I was opposing this as a correction and an alternative to kinship structures. So the kind of embeddedness that I was imagining was not the embeddedness in family lineage and so forth. It was an embeddedness in an ecological connectedness that would include non-humans, like in the biome, for example, within the human body, or an ecological interconnection, us as humans embedded with all the other species on the planets and so forth. But yes, you're absolutely right that when one is part of a collective, the effect of that collective is to complicate the emphasis on individual merit and individual achievement, precisely because you are enmeshed and embedded. And the flip side of the kind of situation that you're identifying as a problem, the young Chinese man who is not admitted because his father owes a debt. Well, the flip side of that is all the students in the US who are admitted because their fathers are alumni, wealthy alumni of colleges. So I don't think that you can just say kinship always results in the failure of the meritocracy. You know, sometimes it can operate the other way as well. But the larger problem that I'm trying to get at here is a movement away from an emphasis on kinship structures to a larger sense of embeddedness that would include our embeddedness in computational media. So as I define cognition, computational media are themselves cognitive actors. And it's this idea of cognition that runs across the idea of humans, non-humans, and technological media, all as cognitive actors. So these are schemes to not necessarily replace kinship structures. As far as I can see, kinship structures are as nearly a universal to human experience as anything I've ever seen. They're found in almost every society. They're in the history of humanity, they were essential for human survivals. And kinship was then elevated away from family into clan, but the same argument holds. Clan is what protects you. Clan is what makes you able to survive. So these have deep, deep roots in human history, human experience. I don't think you're going to replace kinship structures because they're part of human nature. But what you can do is stress other kinds of relational frameworks that act as counterpoises to kinship structures and enable us to think in larger terms than simply family, lineage, clan, region, and so forth. If you can provide the appropriate linking mechanisms that link kinship structures to larger macro global problems like environmental pollution and so forth.
If I may just follow up briefly, well, yes, I agree, and I find that this is an issue I'm puzzled with or struggling with right now myself, because I see all the relational structures in which we're embedded, and of course we cannot escape the kinship structures and so on. But if I understood you correctly, then you're also meant to implement it on a political level, because in order to deal with many of the global challenges like climate change and so on. But once we start to integrate such structures on a political level, it seems to have a lot of problematic, and you acknowledged it earlier as well, of these paternalistic implications, of these, because you're no longer the person who can make these decisions yourself, and whether this is actually the appropriate move for solving these issues is what I'm struggling with.
Yeah, well,
because negative freedom has been such an incredibly important achievement. I just recognize it from as a result of what has happened in the past 5-6 years.
Sorry, may I add just a comment to maybe help in the debate? For me, the crucial question in any of these regards is the kind of plasticity of the field that one creates, the open-endedness, the capacity to reconfigure, which means whether you think of forms of kinship, which are, for example, explored in new ways. In current movements of polyamory, for example, there are different ways of experimenting with modes of kinship which are open-ended and not kind of paternalistic, but capable of reconfiguration. Can one extrapolate this then to also the kind of kinship we have at planetary scale with both computational systems and biospheric phenomena in terms of the reciprocal capacity to reconfigure without us imposing a movement on the biosphere and without simply becoming subsumed by a movement imposed by computational systems, for example. So the reciprocal capacity to reconfigure in all sides of the field is what I think needs to be taken into account to avoid any kind of paternalism in the entire field. Also, so the degree of plasticity of the field is my approach to the politics of relations altogether.
Well, I'd like to return to the idea of linking mechanisms, which I think is absolutely crucial. So the problem of kinship, which I'm identifying as part of human nature, is not going to go away, but it can be put to different uses. In the same way that if you can imagine the invention of carbon coins, you've now found a way for capitalistic enterprises to work on behalf of the environment instead of the destruction of the environment. So carbon coins become a kind of linking mechanism that enable people operating at the meso scale, the human scale, to begin to invest in a different way in the environment. So it's incredibly important to find these linking mechanisms which can result in productive collaboration between the things we can't change and the change directions that we have to go into if we're to avoid environmental collapse. So carbon coin is one of those, but there are others, and it's political. So Stefan mentioned the political dimension. It's political, it's also economic. It's a political decision whether the central banks are going to buy into it. It's also economic because it provides a form of quantitative easing, which is now linked to the environment instead of adversarial to the environment. But what are other linking mechanisms that would enable us to make these fruitful kind of collaborations about the things about human nature that we're not going to change, that would enable us to do a planetary reversal and go in positive directions? And for me, one of those things is to recognize that already those of us in developed societies are so heavily dependent on computational media that we're engaged in a form of deep symbiosis with computational media. And so the challenge for us is not to say, oh, we're not going to use computers, which is obviously impossible, but rather what kind of linking mechanisms can we imagine or invent that would enable these sorts of technologies to be used in a productive as opposed to a counterproductive way. So I think that that the idea of linking mechanisms here is really an important one. And Kim Stanley Robinson suggests a whole panoply of these kinds of linking mechanisms, but it's not exhaustive, of course, by any means, but it's an opportunity, I think, to think creatively and outside the box about how these can be invented and what we can do to both as individuals and collectivities as to invent these sorts of linking mechanisms that'll work.
May I just, since we had Bernard Stiegler in the last conference and he passed away, would you think that one could connect this idea of linking mechanisms to Stiegler's organology, the idea of rethinking our extended organs?
Well, that would be one way to go. I think that in my view, that has sort of limited potential because it still centers the human at the very center of that, and it's the human who is expanding organs and adding prostheses of various kinds and so forth. So it's one way to go. I don't think it has unlimited potential. I think it has definite limits to it.
Then how would you pose the question of the body, since you are one of the pioneers in claiming the erasure of the body in our post-human entanglement with technologies?
Well, of course, I've been thinking about this for a long time. And I wrote in 2017, I published a book called Unthought, which tried to make an argument that the body is a powerful contributor to cognitive processes, that it's a mistake to identify cognition only with consciousness, that there are non-conscious, not unconscious, but non-conscious processes within the body that are providing essential supports for consciousness and in some way are truer to our actual situation in the world than consciousness itself believes to be the case. So I think that the body can be re-understood as a site of cognition that is distributed, embedded, and embodied, and that non-conscious cognition is as important to our operation in the world, perhaps even more important than consciousness. So I do think that the cognitive capacities of the body need to be rethought in terms other than consciousness and reconfigured in relation to other cognitive entities like non-humans and technological media. So part of that argument is that all biological life forms, including plants or entities without brains or nervous systems, are also capable of cognition.
Wonderful.
So
I think we could move on to the...
We have to move to the general, but we can use that to actually connect it to the general discussion. By the way,
Yes.
many thanks for your, many thanks for this presentation, but actually I'm particularly thankful for sort of this non-conscious cognition is something which has fully convinced me, and I've developed that further concerning some moral reflection. So many thanks for having participated, and we will, there are further issues which are raised. I will, in the chat, which I highlight, and I will also remove myself and add the other speakers to the discussions. This was one of the questions which was raised.
I think this is Peggy from New York.
Ah.
Peggy Reynolds. So, how do carbon coins differ from already existing carbon markets?
Well, carbon coins are not really carbon credits, but they're rather pieces of currency that can be exchanged in currency markets that have values against other currencies, and they are more general than carbon markets because they allow the direct drawdown of CO2 from the atmosphere as part of how you can get a carbon coin. You can also get a carbon coin through regenerative agriculture, working compost into the soil, for example, to make it better and more fertile. That's another way you can get carbon coin. So carbon credits are exchanged between energy companies, and they have to do with pollution and so forth. Carbon coins are really more properly a form of currency equivalent to the US dollar or the euro, but they have to do directly with how you can draw down CO2 or prevent CO2 from entering the atmosphere.
So just a tiny technical thing. Marcin, I think there's some echo with your microphone. I muted it provisionally, but just unmute it when you need to talk. There was a bit of echo. Yes, sorry. Well, if there are no direct interventions, may I just go back to the body question, because my own take about it, as I was exposing yesterday, is for me it's extremely problematic and something very urgent to rethink the way in which current approach and design overwhelmingly in digital culture implies what I call the radically atrophied body. And for me, that implies an atrophied cognition. So I link movement and cognition, not just the body, but the body as movement. The types of movement of the body relate to types of cognition. So one of the, I think, urgent matters that need to be reconsidered is precisely this, culture of immobile bodies, which is massively and indeed, one could say increasingly promoted in current digital culture. How then, my further question is, how is that atrophy in which relations happen increasingly through endless screens mediated by opaque algorithmic systems is intrinsically part of our detachment from the world, of our lack of reciprocity at planetary scale, because we no longer feel proprioceptively whatever is around us. We're more and more just alienated because of our atrophy and our mediation through means for atrophy, which imply then this machinery, this planetary machinery, which they call trash human, is creating a trash planet because for the very sake of immobilizing us. So they need to reinvent our kinesthetic relation with everything, including the digital, but not only.
Well, this idea of movement, I think, is very important, and certainly it's deeply tied up with the creation of meaning. So as cognizers, we like to think about meaning in terms of abstract symbols, in terms of language and so forth. But as soon as you get into non-human biological life forms, you're in a different realm as far as meaning is concerned. And for non-human life forms, meaning is generated through precisely behaviors and practices. And biosemiotics is the field that has investigated this extensively. and they've made a very convincing case, to my mind at least, that semiotics, that is the development, the exchange, the dissemination, and interpretation of signs, operates in the non-human realm as well as in the human realm. And in the non-human realm, it's all about behavior, movement, practices, and so forth. And recognizing these as the source of meaning, I think, can also fruitfully feed back into the idea that humans also create meanings through movements, not only through abstract symbols.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one question to Katherine and one to David. Katherine, don't you afraid that democracy as a political system can be an obstacle for application of ecological reciprocity? Because I'm afraid that a kinship is in some way definitionally inserted in the concept of democracy, and maybe we should have another political systems than democracy. And the question to David, I would like to know what is your position, David, in relation to disability problem? Because I'm asking because sometimes disability doesn't necessarily have to be associated with suffering, but with limitations. And what is your opinion about that?
Well, one of the great achievements of liberal philosophy was to expand the idea of kinship beyond the clan to the nation. And that was especially crucial in the democratic countries, in the US, in Europe, England, and so forth. And it was this expansion of kinship to citizenship in the nation that allowed people to make that was a powerful linking mechanism between the family and national citizenship. So it caused national citizenship to be cast in the same terms as kinship. And so national citizenship, this is Lisa Lowe's argument in effect, that national citizenship only intensified the kinship problem by raising it to the national level. But I, as a citizen of the US, in these perilous times for democracy in the US, think that democracy, with all of its faults, is the best form of government that I've seen. That I would much prefer living in the US than in China. China would be far too autocratic a society for my tastes. So I do believe in democracy, flawed as it is. And of course, I recognize all of the flaws of democracy. But in the US now, we're facing a perilous time when the white nationalists, when the QAnon conspiracy theorists, on and on and on, have their own ideas about superior forms of government that are going to replace democracies. To my mind, this is an incredible danger that none of these visions come anywhere close to being as good as democracy as far as I can see. Right now in the US, a QAnon conspiracy is circulating that Donald Trump is still the president, and all the media are lying to us systematically to obscure this fact and make us believe that Biden was elected president of the US. Well, that kind of fantasy land I don't want to participate in, and I think democracy with all its flaws is far, far superior to that, or to white nationalists, or any other version that I've seen. So excuse me, I'm in favor of democracy. I believe in democracy. Let's try to make democracy better. Let's not replace it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, disability. I mean, there are certain forms of disability that are just straightforwardly bad, and I think we ought to phase them out. Certain terrible diseases, but we need to be careful here. I mean, consider something like Down syndrome or Williams syndrome. I mean, someone with Down syndrome, for example, a recent study suggested that around 98 to 99% of people with Down syndrome are self-reportedly happy. Now you compare that statistic with neurotypical people and the population at large. So who exactly has the disability? Or a second example of disability would be autism spectrum disorder. Now, it is extraordinarily challenging to have a child with autism, unlike kids with Down syndrome or Williams syndrome, who are very loving. As someone with severe autism can essentially, a child can be extraordinarily difficult to handle, and yet many of the greatest technological achievements of our civilization, of science, mathematics, and technology, were actually brought about by people extremely high on the autism scale, Asperger's and super. I mean, someone like Newton, he was Asperger. He was socially inept. Many forms of cognitive disability, and yet, of course, one of the greatest minds of all time. Likewise, sort of Fields medalists. So many great minds that have underpinned our civilization have actually had some version or other of autism spectrum disorder. So although, as I said, there are certain forms of disability that are associated with suffering, and I think we should aim to phase them out, we need to be very careful about how we define disability.
Thank you.
Yes, Marcin, please.
If I may comment on Catherine's lecture, I would say that I associate most of your work more on the post-humanist side of the discussion than the transhumanist side. But this view you presented to me was actually much closer, in my opinion, to a transhumanist sort of a utopian perspective, meaning creation of a certain mental construct to which we want to aspire, or to which we want to protect with the use of certain technological means, than a sort of a non-anthropocentric, non-dualist perspective. Because the way I understand the critical post-humanism, correct me if I'm wrong, so the notions of desirability, non-desirability, good, evil, healthy, ill, and so on, are not supposed to be binary in a way that it seemed to me that your message was. Please.
Yes, well, thank you for that observation. I do not claim the title of being a transhumanist, and as you probably know, I've been quite critical of certain strains of transhumanism in the past. And transhumanism, in my view of it, has a very strong individualistic focus. The idea of ascendance, that the prolongation of the individual through life extension, through uploading, and so on and so forth. And those aspects of transhumanism are in direct contrast to the vision that I was presenting, that it's not about the ascendance of the individual. On the contrary, it's about the embeddedness of the individual in complex systems. And a possible affinity between what I was presenting in transhumanism is the emphasis on technical media as an important part of the human future. But I see that in very different terms than many transhumanists do. I do not see the possibility of uploading human consciousness into a computer as being either a realistic or even a desirable part of the human future. On the other hand, I do see a deep symbiosis between cognitive media and humans as definitely a part of our present, not only of our future, but a deepening of this symbiosis in the future. So there are some points of connection between the vision I was presenting. But now to speak to your point, is this a binary good versus evil? I'm sorry I left that impression. I thought that I was trying to make the point that political liberalism had salutary effects in the past. It still has some salutary aspects in the present, but it needs to be rethought and expanded. So it was not trying to present evil as political liberalism on the one hand and good ecological reciprocity on the other. It was rather, how can we correct and expand this traditional and historical framework that we have inherited from the Enlightenment in ways that correct its deficiencies and make it more appropriate to our present situation. So it, to my mind, it was a little more subtle than good versus evil. It was not binary. It was more, more like additive and correction than good versus evil.
We have a bunch.
I just want to ask for a short follow-up. What is your opinion in that case on the notion of uplifting, which is sort of a transhumanist project to basically, bring the level of non-human animals and other entities to a sort of compatible level of intelligence or communication skills, which in a way could enable, in a very sort of anthropocentric manner, but could enable ecological reciprocity, because this would give a genuine voice to these non-human sentient agents.
Well, the only way I can imagine uplifting being done is through a very sophisticated form of gene editing. And I have published just last month an article in Critical Inquiry on gene editing and the dangers of gene editing as well as the potentials of gene editing. Uplifting, why would, well, I guess I can see the reasoning here that if you uplift a chimpanzee so that it's capable of language, then you've given it a voice and it can speak for itself in the councils of the human. But this is radical intervention with another species on a species-wide level that you're doing this for it to have any kind of impact. And to me, this is human hubris written large, that I think it's much better to imagine ecological reciprocity, not in creating, not a Dr. Moreau, island of Dr. Moreau kind of scenario where we create pseudo-humans in every other species capable of it on Earth, but rather we recognize the cognitive capacity of other species as they are and learn to develop linking mechanisms so that we can interact with them effectively. Frankly, I find that kind of a Frankenstein vision run crazy. I think Dr. Moreau had, the island of Dr. Moreau is something that I would recommend to people who want to engage in uplifting.
May I just mention that my concept of BI, body intelligence, precisely appeals to the kind of, it is a kind of version of the non-cognitive, non-conscious cognition, that in terms of how our bodies have this inheritance, we are the offspring of 4 billion years of bacterial evolutions, and so we have a capacity to think as bodies. And I'm not talking now about this kind of rationalistic mode of thinking, which is just one mode of thinking in the body, by which we can much better connect to many other kinds of beings who also have a proprioception, who also have a modes of thinking of the body. So there are many ways, and I am proposing one which is different from, but connects maybe to the non-conscious cognition of Kate, by which we can put this centrality of rationalism out of the center that I think it doesn't deserve. And which not only is necessary to put this rationality out of the center in order to communicate better with other kinds of beings, but it's also this centrality of rationality as a reductive kind of thinking that is causing the planetary disaster. And that is the big, big reason why we should put this kind of mode of thinking, which is just one mode of the body, out of its undeserved centrality.
And I would like to follow up on this. I mean, this is also what David does when he focuses on suffering as a central element. And I would like to raise a question for David as well as for Katherine. Well, in order to specify further that concept of the health of the planet, but also when it comes to the issue of suffering as a central element, because is suffering the only morally relevant capacity, David? Is it? What about because suffering is normally connected with the only entities who possess a fully developed brain have the capacity to experience suffering. What about does that mean any entity which doesn't possess such a fully complexly developed brain is not worthy of being considered morally whatsoever? Does that, I mean, if just thinking about, well, a fertilized egg doesn't have a brain, it only starts developing 3 weeks after, so there is no moral recognition for the fertilized human, there is no recognition for the apple, and there is no recognition for the stone. But in the same way, I would like to raise the same kind of question to Katherine in the way when we talk about global health. So what are the capacities relevant for attributing health to entities who don't possess a complexly developed brain, who only possess life? Is life sufficient for applying sort of the concept to health? Can we apply a concept to health to entities who are silicon based, who are not carbonate based? So could you expand on that further, and how one should take these entities into consideration? That could actually also apply to the issue of humans, future humans who are not yet born. How can you harm someone who's not yet born? And so these are just a range of questions I would like to raise to both of you.
Katherine, do you want to go first, or shall I?
Yeah.
You.
Well, I'll be glad to plunge in here. So planetary health. I think planetary health is maybe not, I know I use that term, but probably it's not the most robust category that one could think about in terms of morality or ethics. And the problems raised by the prospect of health is precisely what you identified, health relative to what species. And of course, our first inclination as humans is to think of health relative to humans. But we could broaden that idea of health to what kind of extinction rate are we encouraging in our present activities. And a lot of biologists have shown that the background extinction rate is now somewhere between 10,000 and 1,000 times faster than it's been in the past. So that's one indication that the biosphere is not becoming more healthy, not only for us, but for a huge variety of species. But now this question of suffering, that's a really interesting one, because suffering implies, I think, a brain and a central nervous system. So already, if you say that only beings with brains and central nervous systems are capable of suffering, you've taken out about 98% of the biomass of the planet, which are plants. So if you subtract 98% of the biomass and you're left with something like between 2 and 5% of the biomass, that doesn't seem to me a very robust way to think about ethics, because you've eliminated most of the life forms on the planet. Now, you could, of course, argue that plants suffer, and there was a book in the 1970s, The Secret Life of Plants, which biologists loathe because it did attribute emotion to plants. Plants, I believe now most plant biologists would agree, are fully capable of cognition. I don't know that they're capable of suffering. So, yeah, I realized there was a period in discussions about ethics, maybe in the 1970s. I'm thinking of Elaine Scarry's book here in particular, where suffering was taken as a moral imperative. If a being is capable of suffering, it has standing. It has standing in philosophy to qualify as a being whose rights should be respected. But we have to compare that against the famous article, Do Trees Have Standing?, which was arguing that, yes, trees should have standing, and they should have standing not because of suffering, but because they are life forms essential for the entire ecological balance in the earth. So maybe suffering is too limited a category to think in global terms about issues of planetary balance. But I'd be interested to hear what David has to say about this as someone who's thought about neurotypicality a long time.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, I think ultimately only beings with a pleasure-pain axis matter, and plants, they don't have nervous systems, their cells are encased within cellulose cell walls, and therefore I don't think they can solve the binding problem. I don't think classical digital computers can solve the binding problem, so there aren't going to be any mind uploads. What matter are essentially animals with nervous systems, and after humans have dismantled the death factories, shut factory farms and slaughterhouses, I think our obligation is to reprogram the biosphere, which is technically feasible. Every cubic meter of the planet is going to be computationally accessible to micromanagement and control. This can conjure up dystopian scenarios, you know, panopticon. On the other hand, if we are prepared to use genetic engineering, synthetic CRISPR-based gene drives that cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance, to drive benign genes across entire species, to use cross-species fertility regulation via immunocontraception, tunable gene drives, reprogram predators. It's a long-term project. If there were global consensus for a kind of secular Buddhism to phase out suffering, it could be done within 100 years or so. In practice, hundreds of years of suffering almost certainly still lie ahead. But nonetheless, the problem of suffering is technically fixable. This is the sheer power of biotechnology. But do we, as a species, have the humanity, the wisdom to actually civilize the biosphere?
So you would think
may I just, I mean, we're already reaching the limit, but we should be able to go a bit longer. There are a couple of questions that Evi wants to raise. There's a few questions in the comments from Nicolás also, who had to leave, but he's left a few questions there. And just before we go, and just reinforce the argument that I completely agree with Kate in the sense that I think suffering is, I would put it even stronger, a completely wrong category for ethics. And I do take planetary health, which I'm developing myself very strongly, as a very urgent category to develop, much more ethically valuable than suffering. But this would be now a very long debate. Let's try to have Evi's questions maybe before, because Nicolás left a few questions. He had to leave, but he can hear the replies in the YouTube recording. So shall we put them in the it's a bit long, but anyway. What do you believe about the social revolution in Chile? In 2019, we had a revolution against the neoliberal government of Sebastián Piñera, and now we are trying to write a new constitution. Then he goes on, but this was only possible with the violence of the protests. Do you think that violence against the government can be part of transposed or metahumanist thinking? I am thinking about resistance against power. Do violence and social protests have a place in transposed or metahumanism? violent protest to overcome what imprisons us. So this is.
Mm-hmm. Questions are a bit related to this.
Well, maybe go ahead, Evi, and then we wrap them up.
Yes, I was also wondering about suffering. So the questions to both Katherine and David. Is suffering and planetary health also related to social circumstances, and especially power, power wherever it comes from? I don't only mean governments. It could be companies. It could be everyone who is in power. And a second question on Katherine's linking mechanisms. I'm a bit stuck with the word war. Why a war for the earth, especially when it comes from those who are considered to be good, let's say, and not a revolt for the earth, or even a revolution? These are my questions.
Well, on the question of violence, we in the U.S. are confronting that very possibility now after the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th. That was violence against the government in favor of subverting valid democratic vote and instituting, in effect, a coup. So that's an example of where, had that insurrection succeeded, it would have undoubtedly led to civil war within the country. And in the case of the U.S., I'm very clear that that would be a civil war of reactionary forces, largely trying to drag the country away from increasing demographics of that threaten white hegemony back into a mindset typical of the 19th century or even the 18th century. On the other hand, Kim Stanley Robinson effectively argues in favor of violence in the cause of what he calls the war for the earth. That is, against those who are polluting, against those who are dumping CO2 into the air, and against those who are polluting the ocean, devastating fish harvests, and so on and so forth. So I guess whether violence is palatable or not very much depends on the end towards which violence is aimed. But anybody who undertakes that kind of violence must recognize that they are playing with fire, that the minute you leave behind the rule of law, you are in effect inviting anarchy, and who knows what's going to come out of that. So I think you have to be in a very desperate situation to turn to violence at all. And you have to be very careful, in my view, about the aims toward which that violence is aimed. I myself am firmly against violence. I don't think that's the way to go, but perhaps that's because I have not lost all faith in the law and legal remedies. So I'll just leave that hanging there. And for Evi's question, she had a second part to her question too, which I'm not sure I fully understood, so perhaps she could rephrase it.
My second part to the question is about the war. This is the part you mean, the part about the war. Because I was just asking if the word war for the earth would be replaced with a term like revolt for the earth.
Oh, war. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, war. So it's essentially the same kind of question. So what is the role of violence, in other words?
I don't mean violence. I'm against violence too. But a war is violence. A revolt can be justice.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay.
So the difference between violent and nonviolent resistance, essentially, that's what you're asking about? Yeah, well, I would much prefer nonviolent resistance.
Yes, and I'm also asking about the political side of revolting against authority.
Right.
Okay, not in violence necessarily.
Right, right.
Okay.
Well, so I would answer again, revolting for what? What is the aim of the revolt? So you have the question about the means of the revolt. Are there violent means? Are there nonviolent means? But then beyond that, you have the question of why. What is the aim of the revolt?
I'm also interested in the semiotics, in the semiotic core of the terms. I mean, war has a negative meaning always. Why revolt can be for the right reasons.
Yeah, sure. Revolt can be for the right reasons, and perhaps Chile is an example of that. We in America, of course, believe that the American Revolution was for the right reasons. So we're a country founded on the idea of revolution. So yes, of course, revolt can be for the right reasons. I will also say revolt can be for the wrong reasons.
And I come from a country highly inspired by the American Revolution for their own revolution. I mean, in 1821, I mean, the Greek Revolution.
Yes,
so
right.
it's about the same reasons.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for having confused you for a while.
So I think we should be coming to the final round. We're sort of already...
So may I just, I was bringing in something that I was muted, so you didn't hear me.
Ah, yes.
No, I was just saying what happens when authority is no longer clearly visible because it's distributed in the kinds of cognitive assemblages of all algorithmic systems. Like how are we to revolt, so to speak, or what kind of new politics of revolt or whatever could one think or would one need when the modes of government of life on the planet are increasingly in the hands of big data networks and autonomous algorithms? Do we need to revolt against the chief of Google, or against what? How? And why my kind of concern is the absolute rampant lack of resistance there is nowadays. I mean, for me, the kind of government that is promoted by Facebook or Google is, okay, it has slightly less problematic implications than the Chinese social credit system, but ultimately it is not so different. It's an aspect is even worse because it's promoting the desire of citizens to be controlled and controlling everything, and mediated by autonomous algorithms, as a desirable social condition that appears to be liberating, when in fact it's a hyper-fascist mode of sociality. So, why don't we have revolts against Facebook and Google and so forth? We mentioned yesterday the tremendous fact that Google fired Timnit Gebru, the ethical leader of the AI labs of Google, because there was a report coming up that they didn't like. This kind of authority, is not being challenged at all. And now, what do we do with that?
Well, I think it's probably useful in thinking about this question to turn away from globalized terms like algorithms toward more specific instances. So there, as you probably know, the Congress holds regular hearings in the US calling up the CEOs of Facebook, Google, and so forth, and trying to hold them to account. I'm not a defender of big tech like that, and I think that social media in general have some really serious problems in terms of the erosion of agreement on basic facts, which social media has certainly helped to subvert in the U.S. context in general. But my mind just kind of goes into starts spinning around when it is confronted with a question like, are algorithms good? Because you need to really break that down and be far, far more specific to have, in my mind, any serious intellectual purchase on that question. But yeah, I agree that's cause for concern, and I think it needs to be interrogated in all different kinds of ways.
Marcin, you wanted to add something? Then we should be coming to the final round as well.
My comment to some of the thoughts that were mentioned before is that I believe that if we are supposed to go on this meta-human endeavor or meta-humanistic endeavor, we must also abandon not only the human perspective, but also the sort of partisan, tribal perspective of, for instance, looking at one side of some political discussion or argument or even fight in a purely, binary perspective, that there is a good or evil side over here. Because, as you probably know, there is a revolt against the big tech, but the problem with this revolt is that the only thing that two sides in America, and I guess throughout the world, can agree on is that there's a problem with big tech power. But one side believes that big tech is limiting the freedom of speech, and the other one is claiming that it's not limiting enough for very reasons. So maybe this is a topic for another forum. Is how can we try to overcome the partisanship and the polarization in the discussions of this day and age? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, there are many thanks. So there are many issues which have been raised, which really deserve some further reflection. And personally, just before we start the final round, maybe one other thought concerning the relationship, planet's health, and suffering, the tension between this issue. It's something which I've actually struggled with for quite some time. Sort of, on the one hand, there was the example that we've developed, or most Anopheles mosquitoes have been developed, have been genetically engineered, which cannot transmit malaria anymore, and they already exist in laboratories. If this was widely employed, generally employed, we would eradicate one species, we would transform one entire species. But as a consequence, every year 500,000 people die as a consequence of malaria. 30, 40, 50 million people suffer from malaria every year. So the suffering would be significantly reduced if we employed that technology, if we transformed one species, basically eradicated one species, created another one. On the other hand, we really radically altered, we would radically alter one species or get rid of it, which would be an enormous change in the ecosystem. And sort of how to balance what is the right response here. And that's already a challenge we are currently that's an option we are currently being confronted with. And we could save 500,000 people's lives every year, which is an enormous amount, which mustn't be neglected either. So maybe this is an issue you would love to address in the final round. Maybe the issue of justified violence and revolts is an issue. In any way, I already thank you for your participation. And now in the final round, all of the speakers are invited to present your the thought which you inspired most, intrigued you most, which you find most fascinating, or something else you would love to add at the very end. So, Katherine, maybe you want to start first.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Stefan, for that summary. And indeed, there are many wonderful topics that have been introduced here that deserve some comment. But I'd like to end by talking about the issue of technical media, which has come up in various forms here, and to reinforce the idea that I think there are profound differences between biological cognition and technical cognition. And I'll just summarize those quickly through what I call the two great inversions. So the first great inversion has to do with the biological mandate, survive and reproduce. And any biological species that does not subscribe to that mandate successfully goes extinct and simply ceases to be a player on life's stage. If it survives and evolves through the eons as humans have, eventually it gets up to the point where it can begin to think about design principles and purposes as humans do. Technical media are the inverse of that. They start from design and purpose. What they have a lot of problems doing is conceiving of such things as survival and reproduction. But as we go deeper and deeper into the development of cognitive media, they become closer and closer to biological brains. And it may be that someday we'll get a software package that can say spontaneously, please don't turn me off. And when that happens, they in effect are at survive and reproduce. So that the two inversions have matched. We've gone from survival to design and purpose. They've gone from design and purpose up to survival. The second great inversion has to do with the fact that biological species from day one have to be able to deal with fluctuating environments in which they are immersed. And then after eons of being immersed, they can eventually advance to where they can begin to think about plans and intentions. With technical media, the opposite happens. They begin with symbolic abstraction. The thing that's very difficult for them is environmental immersion. But now we have systems that have sophisticated sensory capabilities and analytical capabilities that they can begin to deal with things like environmental immersion. So again, you get that inversion. Biological entities go from immersion up to symbolic reasoning. Technical media go from symbolic reasoning up to immersion. So I just want to end with that thought because it emphasizes that we can't, by saying both are cognitive entities, which is a claim that I make, I don't in any sense mean to not pay attention to the profound differences of embodiment of these two different cognitive media and with all of their implications. So I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Many thanks for sharing your latest reflections with us. They're always extremely challenging, extremely important, and they've already very often changed my understanding of many things. So many, many thanks to you. Marcin, please.
So I would just want to quickly repeat my point that I stated just before, that I think that we should think of a way to overcome the conflicts that arise between our, within our societies using the metahumanistic framework. And maybe this will be a challenge that can make, which can make a breakthrough for the perspective into broader philosophical realm, because I'm very confident that many of the challenges mentioned also in this conference will require going beyond the sort of polarized divide.
Many thanks.
Thank you very much for participating and for having the opportunity to exchange views with such prolific thinkers.
No, it was great to have you. You always bring in rather the challenging transhumanist perspectives, which is also very important. So thanks to you. David. You want to be next?
Yes, thank you, Stefan. Yes, essentially, I want to make a plea. Our long-term goal should be a triple S civilization, transhumanist civilization of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. But I think our absolute moral priority is getting rid of suffering, strictly getting rid of involuntary suffering. That means, yes, getting rid of factory farms, slaughterhouses. It means pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, CRISPR genome editing offered to all prospective parents. It involves editing our own genomes, existing humans, but it also exists civilizing the rest of the living world, a pan-species welfare state. And this can be done in a wholly non-violent manner. Even Anopheles mosquitoes, we can use synthetic gene drives to defeat vector-borne disease in Africa without harming a single mosquito. Mosquitoes don't have reproductive rights, and if you use a gene drive to ensure that all the offspring of a mosquito are of a single gender, yes, the population disappears there. Is it sad if we do this that Anopheles mosquitoes won't exist in the wild anymore? Well, species essentialists, traditional conservation biologists might say so, but I would say yes. Let's retire Anopheles mosquitoes. And the final thought I would just like to share. Stefan mentioned earlier his suspicion of utopias, and it's a very well-founded suspicion if you look at the track record of utopian visions. But one of the beauties of hedonic recalibration, i.e. ratcheting up everyone's hedonic set point and hedonic range, is that it doesn't involve expecting people to give up their core values and preference architecture. Just imagine, you wake up tomorrow morning in an exceptionally good mood. You will maintain your core values and preferences, everything from your football team to your political allegiance, but nonetheless, your default quality of life is immeasurably higher. And that's what I would urge, hedonic uplift for all. And thank you again to the other participants. One or two loose ends, I suspect we're going to need to wrap up on another occasion.
Looking forward to do so, to wrap up personally again, meeting up and continuing the discussion. So thanks a lot. Yeah, Jan, do you want to go next?
Yeah, but partially I did my job on the chat on YouTube. I was trying to form a map of concepts that we've discussed during 2 days, and with the help of other participants, we have this map. So I just read the terms, the notions: local, glocal, low global, transhuman, enhancement, well-being, suffering, disability, ecological, reciprocity, agentivity, violence and war. And non-violence, protests, human as virus, movement, embodiment, Africa, China, planet health, care of self, human conscious, biological non-conscious, power, binary notions, technical media, happiness, good life, and utopia, Chile, USA event. Okay, yeah. So this is all we've talked about during 2 days, and for me personally, it was a great inspiration, and maybe for me and for Evi to start thinking about the new kind of post-human reader. In which, from the beginning, we could present non-Western approach, non-Western perspective. Maybe there will be another second version of the reader with such seminal texts. So thank you very much for today's, and I hope we will see each other next time in person on Lesbos.
Perfect. Thanks. Evi, too.
I do hope we can make it for Lesbos, I mean. Jan has said everything. We had the basis for the Posthuman Reader 2. So let's go. Let's go for it. I want to thank all the speakers for your amazing talks. It has been a great honor to be with you here. And I do hope we can see you next year in Lesbos, in the next Posthumanism conference.
Yes, Jaime.
Yes, well, my final remark is just to invite you to feel your bodies right now as you're sitting there in front of this fixed point of vision that has been atrophying bodies for 600 years. So far, to feel the fluctuations of the body and to try to take them on in your lives. As I mentioned yesterday, I think there will be no planetary health if we don't regain a sense of body that is less atrophied, less impoverished, and which is capable of developing more its own BI, its own body intelligence. So I invite you to disalign from any reductive medium you encounter, to let the body fluctuate and elaborate its body intelligence. Feel it right now, feel your fluctuations, and take them on.
It's always a personal, incredible enrichment to be together with all of you. It's wonderful to being part of such a group of intriguing and engaging scholars, intellectuals, artists, and yeah, many thanks for having participated in this event. Hopefully, yes, Lesbos is a fascinating place. For those of you who haven't been there, it's the perfect place, the ideal place for engaging in post-human reflections in a wonderful, intriguing environment. So I invite all of you, return next year to Lesbos together with all of us. Hopefully, it's not going to be the epsilon variant, which will bring about some challenges for all of us, the P variant for all of us. Stay safe, stay healthy, have a wonderful weekend now, and I'm looking forward to meeting all of you. So have a great weekend. Jaime, you will stop the recording?
I'm stopping in 3 seconds, so goodbye.
Bye-bye.